the just. Paulricoeur. Transiated by. Davidpellauer. Preface. I. The texts brought together in this volume do not properly speaking constitute the chapters of a book. They are lectures given in various places under the beneficial constraints of programs for which I did not choose the designated topic. Yet these texts do not come down simply to being occasional writings for some particular circumstance. They allowed me, as a philosophy professor, to express one of my oldest preoccupations, having to do with the few cases within our discipline that deal with issues stemming from the juridical arena, compared with the care given to questions having to do with ethics or politics. This neglect of the juridical is all the more surprising in that it is relatively recent. Plato's Republic is so closely bound up with the question of justice that tradition has made this idea the subtitle of this well-known dialogue. As for Aristotle, in his Ethics he presents a detailed analysis of the virtue of justice. And in the beginning of the modern period, contractual theories of the social bond were worked out in relation to theories of natural law. The philosophies of Hobbes, Machiavelli, and Adam Smith are political theories only to the extent that they propose an explication of the origin and end of law. Leibniz and Kant even composed treatises expressly devoted to the notions of right and law. Nor can we avoid reference to Hegel's principles of the philosophy of right, which often served professional philosophers of my generation as the only basis for reflections on the sequence ethics-law-politics. But even there it was the link between ethics and politics that was the principal object of concern, while there was an impasse over the specific status of the juridical. How are we to account for this general negligence? The shock produced by the outbreaks of violence during our horrifying 20th century explains in large part this losing sight of the juridical problematic in favor of what we can qualify in general terms as the ethico-political. Yet this neglect undercuts the one discipline as much as the other, inasmuch as the latter culminates in the question of the legitimacy of the order by means of which the state makes use of violence, even at the price of that other form of violence from which political power itself stems and whose stigmata it continues to bear. Did not the failure of the Terror during the French Revolution have something to do with the incapacity of the revolution to stabilize itself through a constitution that would have ensured its perpetuity? Does not the whole of Hegel's political philosophy come down to this question of a constitution? If, nevertheless, we have not given as much attention to this problem of the legitimacy of the constitutional order that defines the state as one based on the rule of law, one is it not because, instead of dwelling on the topos of the Hegelian philosophy of right, we have all too willingly allowed our gaze to turn in the direction of the philosophy of history? For Hegel, this follows from his theory of the state once there is no constitutional regime to bring an end to the violent relations among states, which posit themselves on the world scene like great individual violent actors. Once this threshold where the philosophy of history takes over from the philosophy of right has been crossed, it is the drama of war that captures our intellectual energy, at the price of an oft-repeated confession of the incomprehensibility in principle of political evil. I am far from deploring, much less reproving, this obstinate return of the eminently historical problem of political evil, inasmuch as I myself have contributed to it. So it is with the sense of resisting a line of thought strongly encouraged by the spirit of our times that I have undertaken over the past few years to do justice to the question of right and law, to do justice to justice. My work with the Institut de Hautes Études pour la Justice has been particularly influential in that regard. There I encountered the question of the unjust and the just on a level where reflection on the juridical ran little risk of being prematurely taken up into a political philosophy, itself snatched up by a philosophy of history haunted in turn by the pitiless torment arising from and sustained by the aporia of political evil. At the École Nationale de la Magistrature, the training school for public prosecutors and judges, I met the question of the juridical in the figure of the judiciary, with its written laws, its tribunals, its judges, its ceremonial processes, and, as a capstone to all this, the pronouncement of a sentence where the law is stated in the circumstances of a trial, an eminently singular affair. In this way I was led to believe that the juridical, comprehended through the features of the judiciary, could provide philosophy the occasion to reflect upon the specificity of right and the law, in its proper setting, midway between moral philosophy or ethics and politics. In order to give a dramatic turn to the opposition I am making here between a political philosophy, where the question of law is covered over by the haunting question of the irrepressible presence of evil in history, and a philosophy, where law would be recognized in terms of its nonviolent specificity, I propose saying that war is the insistent theme of political philosophy in a piece that of the philosophy of law. If, in fact, conflict, and therefore, in some sense, violence, remains the occasion for judicial intervention, this can be defined by the set of means by which the conflict is raised to the rank of a trial process, this latter being in turn centered on a debate in words, whose initial incertitude is finally decided by a speech act that says what the law is and how it applies. Therefore there exists a place within society, however violent society may remain owing to its origin or to custom, where words do win out over violence. Yes, the parties to a trial do not necessarily leave the courtroom pacified. For that, they would have to be reconciled, they would have to have aired the path of mutual recognition to its end. As I say, under the straightforward title The Act of Judging, in my lecture to the Cour de Cassation, the Court of Appeals in the French legal system, the short-term effect of this act is to decide a conflict, that is, to put an end to uncertainty, whereas its long-term effect is to contribute to social peace, that is, to contribute finally to the consolidation of society as a cooperative enterprise, thanks to those tests of acceptability that go beyond the courtroom and bring into play the universal audience so often referred to by Chaim Perlman. Of course, I do not want to be misled by the rhetorical dramatization that opposes the political problematic of war to the juridical one of peace. Thus, allow me to suggest in a more careful manner the idea of the intersecting priorities of these two problematics. Is peace not also the ultimate horizon of politics thought of as cosmopolitic? And is not injustice, hence finally violence, also the initial situation that law seeks to transcend, without ever fully succeeding? I discuss these questions further in my lecture on the consequences of sanction and the disappointments of rehabilitation. 2. To show that the final peaceful destination of the juridical, to which the judiciary gives particular visibility, is in a way just as originary as is the inclination toward violence exhibited by political evil, even while lacking a demonstration that is without a doubt always beyond proof, it still seems to me that there is at least one eloquent symptom in the testimony of our memory when it seeks to give strength to our first encounters with the question of the unjust and the just. In invoking such childhood memories, I deliberately speak of the unjust before the just as Plato and Aristotle do so often, and so intentionally. Was not our first entry into the region of lawfulness marked by the cry, "That's not fair"? This is a cry of indignation, one whose perspicacity is sometimes confusing when measured against the yardstick of our adult hesitations when summoned to pronounce in positive terms upon the justice or fairness of something. Indignation, in the face of injustice, comes far in advance of what John Rawls calls considered convictions, whose clash no theory of justice can deny or refuse to consider. Let us recall some of those typical situations where our indignation was aroused. They were, for one thing, those unequal shares that we found unacceptable. They were, for another, unkept promises that for the first time shook our innocent confidence in what people said, upon which rested every exchange, contract, and compact. They were also punishments that seemed to us out of proportion with our supposed petty crimes, or praise that we saw arbitrarily given to others rather than ourselves, in short, unmerited retributions. Let us sum up these motives for indignation: disproportionate retributions, betrayed promises, unequal shares. Can we not decipher in them after the fact the lineaments of the juridical order, penal law, the law of contracts and exchanges, distributive justice? What is more, do we not discern in such indignation a precise expectation, that of a word that will create a just distancy between the antagonists, that will bring an end to their head-to-head confrontation? The moral intention of indignation lies in this confused expectation of a victory of the word over violence. But why then not just hang on to indignation? What does it lack if it is to be equated with an authentic sense of justice? It is not sufficient to say that what is still lacking are the positive criteria of justice. We have still to identify the obstacle that prevents the conquest of what I have just called a just distance between antagonists about shares, exchanges, or retributions our indignation denounces as unjust. This obstacle is the desire for vengeance, that is, the claim to obtain justice for oneself, even at the price of adding violence to violence, suffering to suffering. The great conquest, in this respect, consists in separating vengeance and justice. For the short circuit of vengeance, justice substitutes creating a distance between protagonists, where establishing a difference between the crime and the punishment is the symbol of penal law. How can such a difference be instituted, if not through the addition of a third party who would not be one of the protagonists? An important equation, whereby the just begins to be distinguished from the unjust, proposes itself here, the equation between justice and impartiality. Just distance, the mediation of a third party, and impartiality present themselves as the great synonyms of a sense of justice along the path down which indignation has led us from our earliest youth. In the preceding pages, I first referred to the motives for my relatively recent desire to withdraw the analysis of the juridical from the tutelage of the ethico-political. Without yet leaving the plane of motivations, I next sought in memories of our youth some testimony to a kind of ontogenetic order leading back to our earliest demands for justice. The moment has come to try to move from these present and past motives to reasons capable of legitimating the intelligible discourse the juridical enterprise presupposes on the unjust and the just. If I have been able, these past few years, to present the reflections you are about to read, at the price sometimes of a certain technical language that will call for the careful attention required by an argumentative discourse, this is because the philosophical place of the just was already pointed out and delimited in the little ethics of my oneself as another. In the remainder of this preface I propose to set out the ties of dependence between the studies you are about to read and the conceptual structures of the three studies comprising that ethics. Readers who are not familiar with that work, in which the essence of my philosophical work can be found, will no doubt appreciate an outline of the three sections of oneself as another that taken together constitute my contribution to moral philosophy. The architecture of these chapters rests on the intersection of two axes, hence on two different directions of reading. The first axis, which we can call the horizontal axis, is that of the dialogical constitution of the self. The second, vertical axis is that of the hierarchical constitution of the predicates that qualify human actions in terms of morality. The philosophical / pound of the just thus found itself situated, in oneself as another, at the intersection of these two orthogonal axes and the two readings they mark out. Let me now try to lay things out somewhat more comprehensively. To begin, let us take up the horizontal reading, whose thematic, I have said, is the dialogical constitution of the self. A philosophical theory of the just then finds its first handhold in the assertion that the self only constitutes its identity through a relational structure that places the dialogical dimension above the monological one inherited from the great tradition of reflective philosophy, which is tempted to privilege the latter rather than the former. However, this reference to the other, beginning at the very threshold of a reflection on the constitution of the self, would remain banal and certainly would not suffice to indicate the place where the question of justice can be encountered if, from the beginning, we did not distinguish two distinct senses of the notion of the other or of the other person. The first other, if I may put this way, offers himself through his face, in his voice, with which he addresses me, designating me as the second person singular. This is the other of interpersonal relations. Friendship, opposed in this context to justice, is the emblematic virtue of this immediate relationship that accomplishes the miracle of an exchange of roles between beings that cannot be substituted for each other. You are the you that says you to me and to whom I respond, as Emmanuel Levinas loved to repeat, here I am me, in the accusative case. But however wonderful the virtue of friendship may be, it is not capable of fulfilling the task of justice, nor even of engendering it as a distinct virtue. The virtue of justice is based on a relation of distance from the other, just as originary as the relation of proximity to the other person offered through his face and voice. This relation to the other is, if I may so put it, immediately mediated by the institution. The other for friendship is the you, the other for justice is anyone, as is indicated by the Latin adage suum quique tribuer. Below, along the second axis of our reading, we shall explore the connotations of this distributive pronoun, found in any conception of society as an enterprise of distributing roles, tasks, benefits, and obligations. In fact, we have already encountered this anyone in those exemplary situations in which our youthful indignation lashes out against injustice, unequal shares, failure to keep one's word as given, unfair retributions, all institutional circumstances, in the broadest sense of the term, where justice presents itself as a just distribution. The same thing applies in those infinitely more complex situations where human interactions are caught up in those subsies. Terms that Jean-Marc Ferry, in Les Puissances de l'expérience * calls orders of recognition. At each degree of complexity, justice presents itself, in the terms with which John Rawls opens his theory of justice, as the first virtue of social institutions. 5. The case of the judicial institution is distinctive in this regard, yet particularly favorable to a narrow determination of anyone according to the institution. With the institution of the tribunal, the trial brings into confrontation parties who are constituted as others by the judicial procedure. What is more, the institution is incarnated in the person of the judge, who, as a third party between the two parties, takes on the figure of a second-order third party. The judge marks out the just distance the trial establishes between the parties in conflict. True, the judge is not the only one to take on this function of a second-order third party. Without giving way to an excessive penchant for symmetry, we could say that the judge is to the juridical what the teacher of justice is to moral thought, and what the prince, or any personalized figure of sovereign power, is to the political. But it is precisely in the figure of the judge that justice is recognized as the first virtue of social institutions. 4. It is only with respect to our second axis, the vertical axis, that we can more properly speak of a conceptual architecture having to do with the moral philosophy presented in oneself as another. The distribution in terms of three levels of predicates, which determine what Charles Taylor, in his Sources of the Self 6 calls strong evaluations of action, is so significant that it is what shaped the division of my reflections devoted to morality into 3 chapters. 7. At the first level, the predicate that morally qualifies action is the predicate good. The point of view from which this predicate arises can be called teleological, inasmuch as the good designates the telos of an entire life in quest of what human agents can consider as an accomplishment, a crowning achievement. It is important that the word life appears within the framework of a philosophy of action. It recalls that human action is born by desire, and correlatively by a lack, as well as that it is in terms of these words desire and lack that we can speak of the wish for a full life. The connections among life, desire, lack, and accomplishment constitute the basis of morality, for which I reserve, as a convention of language, the term ethics. This is why I define ethics as the wish for a good life. What does this initial determination of morality in terms of the predicate good have to do with an investigation into the just? Simply this, that the three-term relation placed along the horizontal axis discussed above, a relationship wherein each individual mediated by the institution constitutes the third member, finds its initial formulation in the teleological reading of the moral constitution of action. I am making use here again of the formula I proposed in oneself as another, the wish for a fulfilled life in and with others in just institutions. Justice, for this reading, is an integral part of the wish to live well. In other words, the wish to live in just institutions arises from the same level of morality as do the desire for personal fulfillment and the reciprocity of friendship. The just is first an object of desire, of a lack, of a wish. It begins as a wish before it is an imperative. Here is the mark of a rootedness in life. Certainly, there is no human life that should not be examined, in the sense of the Socratic adage. and it is the necessity of this examination that, in convergence with the other requirements I shall speak of below, forces it to be raised from the teleological to the deontological point of view. But it remains the case that what calls for such examination is life, the way of leading one's life. The first question in the moral order is not what must I do, but rather how would I like to lead my life. Aristotle had already indicated that the question of the just belongs to this interrogation when he asserted, at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, that the goal of happiness did not reach the end of its trajectory in solitude, to which I would add, friendship, but in the setting of the city. Politics, taken in the broad sense, thus constituted the architectonic of ethics. I would say the same thing in a language closer to that of Hannah Arendt: it is within the interest that the wish for a good life finds its fulfillment. It is as citizens that we become human. The wish to live within just institutions signifies nothing else. The thesis of the primacy of the ideological approach in the determination of the idea of the just finds an echo in the very composition of the collection of texts brought together here. Without regard for the chronology of their first publication, I have placed at the beginning of this volume 2 lectures where the emphasis is on the rootedness of the idea of justice in the ground of a philosophical anthropology. The lecture introduced by the question "Who is the subject of rights?" is organized around the idea of capacity, more precisely around the idea of the capable human being. The next lecture is devoted more specifically to the latter of these notions, that of responsibility. There I argue that the range of the most recent uses of this term can be unfolded around the pole constituted by the idea of imputation, that is, the idea that action can be assigned to the account of an agent taken to be its actual author. These two ideas of capacity and imputability, dealt with in these lectures without regard for how they go together, take on a new aspect when they are brought together, as I am doing here, under the aegis of an ideological approach to the idea of the just. When set back upon the trajectory of the wish for a good life, they show themselves as constituting the two complementary anthropological presuppositions of an ethics of the just. Let us continue our ascending journey from level to level. After the predicate good, arising at the ideological level, comes reference to the predicate obligatory, on the deontological level. This is the level of the norm, of duty, of interdiction. Just as moral philosophy cannot do without some reference to the good, to the wish for a good life, except at the price of ignoring the rootedness of moral philosophy in life, in desire, in what is lacking, and in what we wish for, so the transition from the wish to the imperative, from desire to interdiction, appears to be inevitable. Why? For the fundamental reason that action implies a capacity to do something that gets carried out on the interactive plane as the power exercised by an agent on another agent who is the recipient of this power. This power over others offers the permanent occasion for violence in all its forms, from the lie, where only the instrument of language seems to be misused, to the imposition of suffering, culminating in the imposition of a violent death, and in the horrible practice of torture, where the will to humiliate exceeds that of merely imposing suffering. In short, it is owing to the wrong that one person inflicts on another that the moral judgment given an action has to add the predicate of the obligatory to that of the good, usually under the negative figure of what is prohibited. In this respect, an investigation that deliberately aims at the idea of the just must not allow itself to be caught off guard here. What I have already said above about the precedence of the recognition of injustice over the just finds its confirmation and legitimation here. What do we get indignant about, in the case of shares, exchanges, retributions, if not the wrong that human beings inflict upon one another on the occasion of the power over one will exercises in the encounter with another will? But if violence constitutes the primary circumstance in the transition from a teleological to a deontological point of view, it does not take the place of an argument in favor of the predicate of the obligatory. Everything remains to be done and to be said concerning the weight of this predicate. Two remarks made earlier independently of each other may, by being joined, set us on the way to the decisive thesis. I said, in the wake of our reflections on indignation, that it was under the condition of impartiality that indignation can free itself of the desire for vengeance that incites the victim to seek to obtain justice for himself. The rule of justice called for in this context, we noted, is incarnated within the figure of the judge, considered as a second-order third person. Let us bring these two ideas together. What accounts for the link between the impartiality of judgment and the independence of the judge if not the reference to the law? Here we come to the heart of the deontological point of view. What, in obligation, obliges is the claim for universal validity attached to the idea of the law. In oneself as another, I unfolded the implicit meanings of this claim for universal validity attached to the idea of the law by taking as my guide, for a second time, the threefold relation of what is one's own, what is near, and what is distant. I shall not repeat here my argumentation in a Kantian style by which the threefold relation of the first level allows itself to be rewritten in terms of a second threefold relation of a second order, which coincides essentially with the three formulations of the Kantian imperative: universalization of the maxim of action, respect for humanity in both myself and the other person, and the establishment of an order of ends whose subjects will at the same time be its legislators. I want instead to concentrate on the important mutation the sense of justice undergoes in passing from the teleological to the deontological point of view. What is centrally at stake here is the forma/status attached to the universal claim once the law is not just moral but juridical. Let me recall in a few words the thesis I defend in Oneself as Another, which I first began to expand in an essay from 1991, reprinted in Lectures I, Autor to Pollock under the title The Just Between the Legal and the Good. Far from the idea of the just finding on the deontological level a consistency such that it can be removed from any reference to the good, reasons having to do with the very import of the claim to universality ensure that this claim finds itself held in tension between an indelible reference to the good and the attraction exercised upon it by the purely procedural status of the operations constitutive of legal practice. 9. In order to make good on my argument, I adopt the description John Rawls gives, in his theory of justice, of society considered as a vast enterprise for distributing goods from goods of the market such as remunerations, financial holdings, social benefits, passing through non-market goods such as citizenship, security, health, education, to those positions of command, authority, or responsibility of every sort exercised within the framework of institutions of every sort. All these goods constitute the stakes for distribution. But such a distribution poses a problem inasmuch as it consists, essentially, in arithmetically unequal shares. The question then is to know whether there exist unequal shares that are more just or less unjust than others. Rawls's solution is by now well known. It consists essentially in associating the deontological point of view with the contractual tradition where recourse to accepted procedures for dividing things reinforces the right decision belonging to the deontological approach in general, without making any reference to the substantial weight of the goods to be distributed. In order to do this, we are to imagine an unreal original situation where the partners, placed by hypothesis in a relation of mutual fairness, make one choice, among many, of those principles of justice likely to be accepted by everyone. The procedural operation presiding over the choice of a rule of justice, and consisting in maximizing the smallest of the unequal shares, then results from the conjunction of the deontological point of view and the quite specific form of contractualism bound to the hypothesis of the original situation set within the framework of the fable of the veil of ignorance. The thesis that I propose for discussion, and that I willingly make the second theorem of my theory of the just, following the theorem that the sense of justice is organically bound to the wish for a good life, is that the sense of justice, raised to the level of formalism required by the contractual version of the deontological point of view, cannot be made entirely independent of any reference to the good, owing to the very nature of the problem posed by the idea of a just distribution, namely, taking into account the real heterogeneity of the goods to be distributed. In other words, the deontological level, rightly taken as the privileged level of reference for the idea of the just, cannot make itself autonomous to the point of constituting the exclusive level of reference. It is under the aegis of this second theorem that I have chosen to place a number of lectures, the first of which takes up again, in a more critical vein, the question presently under discussion, namely, whether a purely procedural theory of justice is possible. This is followed by a brief examination of Rawls's work subsequent to A Theory of Justice, where he makes more specific the cultural and political conditions in terms of which his theory of justice applies to the practice of democratic societies. Without denying the formal arguments that suffice for the elaboration of a theory of justice, the additions and corrections Rawls proposes, with exemplary intellectual probity, will orient my own discussion concerning the conditions for the exercise of justice, which I shall place below under the third point of view of my moral theory, the point of view I place under the aegis of practical wisdom. It is through a direct confrontation with Rawls's procedural formalism that, in the next lecture, I take up those theories that constitute a plea in favor of a pluralism of instances of justice. There I combine the theses Michael Walzer sets out in his Spheres of Justice, which in America are representative of what is called contextualism or communitarianism, with those of Luc Boltanski and Laurent Thévenot, who propose another division of the supposedly indivisible idea of justice starting from the idea of justification in terms of qualifying tests having to do with economies differentiated by scale. Another stake besides that of the indivisibility of the idea of justice, inseparable from its formal status, is taken up in these two lectures, namely the question of whether citizenship, that is, the modes of belonging to a political body, is itself a good to be distributed, homogeneous with those that have already been briefly mentioned. In this way, the question of politics gets reintroduced through a reflection on the just that some have sought to isolate from the tutelage of the problematic of power, sovereignty, violence, and political evil. I do not say that in this way politics takes its vengeance, I simply mean to show that it cannot be forgotten and that its enigmatic character is reinforced by the attempts to align it with the other foci of what we might call juridicity, thanks to a deliberate effort to dissect the unitary idea of justice. The juridic, encouraged by a proliferation of kinds of justice, runs aground no less than does the political, from which we set out to dissociate ourselves. The connection is more tenuous between this group of lectures and the one joined to it where I discuss Hannah Arendt's attempt to derive a theory of political judgment from the theory of the judgment of taste Kant set forth in the Critique of Judgment. Apart from my oft-expressed admiration for the work of Hannah Arendt, I was led to include this lecture in this volume and in this place by the focus on the act of judging, the title Arendt herself chose for the third volume of her important trilogy, Thinking, Willing, Judging, unfortunately left unfinished owing to her untimely death. It goes well with the ambition of this collection to recall that the act of judging is not confined to the courts, as my own insistence on making the judiciary the privileged focus of the juridical might suggest. In fact, it is good that a return to the Kant of the third critique brings back into focus for our own examination the problematic of the reflective ahagmenti, which for Kant himself encompasses, beyond the judgment of taste, the teleological judgment and, by way of it, the whole Kantian philosophy of history. The suggestion therefore arises that the theory of justice could be taken up in another way within a broadly Kantian problematic, if we were to shift our angle of attack from the critique of practical reason to that of the critique of judgment. In one sense, the group of lectures placed under the third point of view, that of practical reason, which in oneself as another, distinguished from the teleological and the deontological points of view, speaks to this point. In them I wanted to make use of this transition to warn my audience against any tendency to limit my contribution to the discussion of the moral problem, to the opposition between a teleological and a deontological approach. Over against such a reductive move, I would reply that the two studies in oneself as another devoted to the two levels of moral judgment governed by the predicates of the good and the obligatory are merely preparatory exercises for the confrontation that gives me the most difficulty, the confrontation with those situations I place globally under the heading of the tragic dimension of action. It is at this stage that the moral conscience, as an inner forum, one's heart of hearts, is summoned to make unique decisions, taken in a climate of incertitude and of serious conflicts. Thus the crucial study 9 is devoted to the structure of moral judgment in a unique situation in terms of what I call practical wisdom. With this term we return to the Aristotelian virtue of phronesis, reinterpreted by Heidegger and Gadamer. In this way, the thesis outlined above that the deontological point of view cannot eclipse the teleological point of view on the level of a general theory of justice finds a complement in the thesis that the just in the final analysis qualifies a unique decision made within a climate of conflict and incertitude. The search for justice ends with a heartfelt conviction, set in motion by the wish to live in just institutions, and ratified by the rule of justice for which procedural formalism serves to guarantee impartiality. If my own reflection on the just has found its privileged reference in the institution of the judiciary, this is because there we can see clearly the need to bring the idea of the just to the final phase of the trial process, where the law is stated here and now. However, we would fall into the opposite error of an exclusive emphasis on formalism if we were to take the problematic of the application of the norm as not just a minor point, but as insignificant for any juridical theory worthy of the name. We might be led to such an erroneous misvaluation either by a purely mechanical conception of the application of a norm to a case, or by an overly discretionary conception of the pronouncement of sentence. The whole problem, which I will risk qualifying with the adjective frenetic, lies in exploring the middle zone where the judgment is formed, halfway between proof, defined by the constraints of logic, and sophism, motivated by the desire to seduce or the temptation to intimidate. This middle zone can be designated by many names, depending on the strategy used: rhetoric, to the extent that rhetoric, following Aristotle's definition, consists in giving a rejoinder to dialectic, itself understood as a doctrine of probable reasoning; hermeneuticy, to the extent that this joins application to understanding or explanation; poetic, to the extent that the invention of an appropriate solution to the unique situation stems from what, since Kant, we have called the productive imagination, in order to distinguish it from the merely reproductive imagination. 10. Today I would say that the reflective judgment of Kant's third critique brings together the three aspects distinguished by these three disciplines: probability, subsumption, innovation. Hence the third theorem of the conception of the just unfolded in the lectures collected in this volume will be that the meaning of justice, which conserves its rootedness in the wish for a good life and finds its most ascetic rational formulation in procedural formalism, does not attain concrete plenitude except at the stage of the application of the norm in the exercise of judgment in some situation. The four lectures that make up the third group of texts assembled here should be seen in light of this theorem. The order in which this group is presented responds to a double preoccupation, that of underlining the epistemological specificity of the act of judging, and that of following the unfolding of this act to its conclusion in time. Thus, in the lecture entitled Interpretation and/or Argumentation, I link the phase of the hearing, within the framework of the judicial trial, to the problematic I have just placed under the aegis of the reflective judgment. Indeed, it is at this stage of the hearing that we best see argumentatione where the logic of the probable predominates, and interpretatiori where the innovative power of the imagination acts on the very production of arguments, meet and become entangled with each other. From here, we move, in the next lecture, to the moment where the word that states the law is spoken. This is the moment of the act of judging in the most point-like sense of the term. The judgment has not only a logical import as an act of discourse, but also a moral aspect inasmuch as the ultimate finality of the act of judging, which lies in its contribution to civil peace, goes beyond the finality of the act that brings an end to uncertainty. However high the stakes in this reflection may be, which brings us back again to our initial considerations on the confrontation between war and peace that takes place at the junction between the juridical and the political. Nevertheless, I did not want to stop with this dream of peace that constitutes in a way the utopia of the law. In the lecture entitled Sanction, Rehabilitation, Pardon, I have tried to follow the act of judging through to its denouement, beyond even the pronouncing of sentence, to the execution of the penalty. I wanted in this way to attest that the wish to live in just institutions, and in particular in equitable judicial institutions, will only be satisfied if application is not limited to subsuming a case under a norm, but rather completes its course in the application of the penalty. It seemed to me that it is finally in the measures of rehabilitation, allowing the guilty party to be re-established in the plenitude of his juridical capacities and the exercise of his citizenship, that the act of judging renders homage to its ultimate end, to reinforce civil peace. Finally comes the lecture entitled The Law and Conscience, for the simple reason that the two notions brought together under this title designate respectively the two large problematics into which the theory of justice divides, the problematic of the self, in search of its moral identity, and that of the predicates presiding over the moral qualification of human action. For its title I have given this collection of lectures the simple substantive adjective the just. This term applies to persons, actions, and institutions. About all of them, we can say they are just or unjust. Yet from another point of view, that of the level where the act of judging is formed, the same predicate can have several senses. On the teleological plane of the wish to live well, the just is that aspect of the good relative to something other. On the deontological plane of obligation, the just is identified with the legal. It remains to give a name to the just on the plane of practical reason, the one where judgment occurs in a situation. I propose that the just then is no longer either the good or the legal, but the equitable. The equitable is the figure that clothes the idea of the just in situations of incertitude and of conflict, or, to put it a better way, in the ordinary or extraordinary realm of the tragic dimension of action. Who is the subject of rights? I want to show that the question with a juridical form, who is the subject of rights, is not to be distinguished in the final analysis from the question with a moral form, who is the subject worthy of esteem and respect. Furthermore, the question with a moral form refers in turn to a question of an anthropological nature: what are the fundamental features that make the self capable of esteem and respect? This regressive analysis, leading from the concept of right to the moral and from the moral to the anthropological, invites us to concentrate as we begin on the specificity of the question who, in relation to the questions what and why. The question what calls for a description, the question why for an explanation. As for the question who, it calls for an identification. It is on the nature of this latter operation, presupposed in every discussion about identity, whether of persons or of historical communities, that I will focus in the first part of my lecture. It is by examining the most fundamental forms of the question who, and the responses to it, that we are led to give its full meaning to the notion of a capable subject. From this, in the second part of the lecture we can turn to consider the ascending order of interpersonal and institutional mediations that assure the transition from the capable subject to the subject of actual rights on the moral, juridical, and political planes. The notion of capacity will be central to my presentation. It constitutes in my view the ultimate referent of moral respect and of the recognition of a human being as a subject of rights. If such a function can be assigned to a person, it is owing to its intimate connection to the notion of personal or collective identity. The most direct way to bring out this connection is to consider the different assertions concerning personal or collective identity as all being responses to a series of questions implying the relative pronoun who. Who is it that is speaking? Who did this or that action? Whose story is this? Who is responsible for this injury or this wrong done to another person? The question who is speaking is assuredly the most primitive, inasmuch as all the others imply the use of language. Only someone capable of designating himself as the author of his utterances can give a response to this question. Examination of this point comes from a pragmatics of discourse, illustrated by the well-known theory of speech acts. Still, we must add to this pragmatics a reflexive prolongation in order to get to the multiple acts of actual utterance by means of which the speaker designates himself or herself as the identical pole or, to use another Husserlian metaphor, the focal point from which radiate an indefinite number of acts of discourse. The second question about who is posed in the same way: who is the author of an action? I suggested above that the answer to the question what is provided by a description making use of the verbs of action, and that the question why is satisfied by an explanation in terms of causes and motives. The question of the attribution of an action to someone is of another order and answers the question who. Peter Strawson and H.L.A. Hart speak in this regard of ascription. I myself would say assignment. 1. The identification of an agent, hence the assignment of an action or of a segment of an action to someone, is often a difficult operation. For example, when one undertakes to evaluate the degree of implication of this or that person in a complex enterprise involving several agents. This problem arises constantly on the plane of historical knowledge or in the course of juridical procedures aimed at uniquely identifying the responsible individual who will eventually be forced to compensate an injury or to suffer the penalty for some delinquent or criminal act. As in the preceding case of discourse, the capacity of a human agent to designate himself as the author of his acts has considerable significance for the subsequent assignment of rights and duties. Here we touch upon the heart of the idea of capacity, namely, the ability to do something, what in English is designated by the term agency. Unfortunately, our philosophical vocabulary here is quite poor. Either we content ourselves with metaphors, or we go back to the most primitive usage of the idea of an efficient cause. This latter, expelled from physics since Galileo and Newton, leads back in a way to its birthplace, which is our experience of the power we exercise over our bodily members and, through them, on the course of things. This power of intervention is presupposed by the ethico-juridic concept of imputation, so essential to the assignment of rights and duties. We advance another step in our exploration of the notion of a capable subject by introducing, along with the temporal dimension of action and of language itself, the narrative component of personal or collective identity. Examining this notion of narrative identity gives us occasion to distinguish the identity of the self from that of things. This latter kind of identity comes down in the final analysis to the stability, even the immutability of a structure, illustrated by the genetic code of a living organism. Narrative identity, in contrast, admits change. This mutability is that of the characters in stories we tell, who are imploded along with the story itself. This notion of narrative identity is of the greatest importance in inquiry into the identity of peoples and nations, for it bears the same dramatic and narrative character we all too often confuse with the identity of a substance or a structure. At the level of the history of different peoples, as at that of individuals, the contingency of turning points in the story contributes to the overall significance of the story that is told as well as of the protagonists. To recognize this is to free ourselves of a prejudice concerning the identity claimed by different peoples under the heading of arrogance, fear, or hate. A final stage in the reconstitution of the notion of a capable subject is attained with the introduction of ethical or moral predicates, attached either to the idea of the good or to that of obligation. These predicates apply first of all to those actions we judge and evaluate as good or bad, permitted or forbidden. They further apply reflexively to the agents themselves to whom we impute these actions. It is here that the notion of a capable subject reaches its highest significance. We ourselves are worthy of esteem or respect insofar as we are capable of esteeming as good or bad, or as declaring permitted or forbidden, the actions either of others or of ourselves. A subject of imputation results from the reflexive application to agents of predicates like good or obligatory. I want to add to these considerations two remarks. First, I would like to suggest that there is a bond of mutual implication between self-esteem and the ethical evaluation of those of our actions that aim at the good life, just as there is a bond between self-respect and the moral evaluation of these same actions, submitted to the test of the universalization of our maxims of action. Taken together, self-esteem and self-respect define the ethical and moral dimension of selfhood, to the extent that they characterize human beings as subjects of ethico-juridical imputation. I want next to say that self-esteem and self-respect are not simply added to the forms of self-designation we have been considering. They include and in a way recapitulate these forms. In terms of what then, someone may ask, can we esteem or respect ourselves? As, in the first place, capable of designating ourselves as the speakers of our utterances, the agents of our actions, the heroes and narrators of the stories we tell about ourselves. To these capacities are added those that consist in evaluating our actions in terms of good and obligatory. We esteem ourselves capable of esteeming our own actions, we respect ourselves in that we are capable of impartially judging our own actions. Self-esteem and self-respect are in this way reflexively addressed to a capable subject. WHO is the subject of rights. Dialogical and institutional structure of the subject of rights. What does the capable subject, whose levels of constitution we have just considered, lack in order to be a veritable subject of rights? It lacks the conditions for the actualization of its capacities. These have need of the continual mediation of interpersonal forms of otherness and of institutional forms of association in order to become real powers to which correspond real rights. Let us try to spell this out in greater detail. Indeed, it will be helpful, before trying to draw the consequences of this affirmation for political philosophy and the philosophy of right, for us to agree on what we mean by what I have just called the interpersonal forms of otherness and institutional forms of association. Our examination must bear not just on the necessity of a mediation, which we can call mediation of the other in general, but on a division within otherness itself into interpersonal and institutional otherness. It can be tempting for a dialogical philosophy to limit itself to relations with other individual people, which are usually placed under the heading of an I-thou dialogue. It is precisely these relations with other individuals that are held to be worthy of being qualified as interpersonal. But this face-to-face relation lacks the relation to A/RC/party that seems just as primitive as the relation to an individual you. This point is of the greatest importance if we want to account for the transition from the notion of the capable human being to that of the real subject of rights. Only the relation to the third, situated in the background of the relation to the you, gives us a basis for the institutional mediation required by the constitution of a real subject of rights, in other words, of a citizen. This double necessity, that of the mediation by otherness in general and that of the distinction between the other as a you and the other as a third party, can be established on the plane of fundamental anthropology, to which we appealed in order to elaborate the notion of a capable subject. At each of the four levels we have considered in succession, we can show the necessity of a triadic constitution governing the passage from capacity to actualization. Let us return to the first level of our anthropological analysis of the capable human being, to the level of the speaking subject. We place the principal accent on the capacity of the speaker to designate himself as the unique speaker of his multiple utterances. But we pretended to ignore that it is in the context of interlocution that a subject of discourse can identify and designate himself. Within this context, and corresponding to the first-person speaker, there is a second-person hearer of what is said. An utterance, consequently, is at least a bipolar phenomenon, joining an I and a you, whose places can be exchanged, without the persons in question becoming intersubstitutable. Our mastery of the personal pronouns is not complete so long as the rules for this exchange are not fully understood. This mastery contributes in the following way to the emergence of the subject of rights. Like me, the other can designate himself as an I when he speaks. The expression like me already announces the recognition of the other as my equal in terms of rights and duties. Having said this, we immediately see that this analysis where the other figures only as an individual you remains truncated. Not only do we lack the he/she/it of the triad of pronouns, we lack the reference to the very institution of language in which the interpersonal relation is framed. In this sense, he/she/it represents the institution, inasmuch as it encompasses all the speakers of one natural language who know themselves and who are bound together by the recognition of the common rules that distinguish one language from another. This recognition does not reduce to just the adoption of the same rules by everyone, it also requires the confidence each one of them places in the rule of sincerity, without which any linguistic exchange would be impossible. I expect that each will mean what he or she says. This confidence establishes public discourse on a basis of trust where the other appears as a third party and not just as a you. In truth, this fiduciary base is more than an interpersonal relation, it is the institutional condition for every interpersonal relation. The same triadic relation of me/you/third person can be found on the plane we have distinguished by the question who acts. Who is the author of an action? The capacity to designate oneself as the author of one's own actions is inscribed in a context of interaction where the other figures as my antagonist or my helper, in relations that vary between conflict and interaction. But innumerable others are implied in any undertaking. Each agent is bound to these others by the intermediary of different orders of social systems. We can, with Jean-Marc Ferry, designate with the term orders of recognition the large-scale organizations that structure interaction. Technical systems, monetary and fiscal systems, juridical systems, bureaucratic systems, pedagogical systems, scientific systems, media systems, and so on. It is first as one of these systems that the democratic system is inscribed in the sequence of orders of recognition. That recognition is what is at stake in this organization has to be recalled over against a systematic abstraction that would banish consideration of those initiatives and interventions by which persons posit themselves over against such systems. Conversely, that the organization of social systems is the required mediation for recognition must be affirmed over against a personalist communitarianism that might dream of reconstructing the political bond on the model of the personal bond illustrated by friendship and love. Some may doubt whether narrative identity presents the same threefold structure as do discourse and action. But they are wrong. Life stories are so intertwined with one another that the narrative anyone tells or hears of his own life becomes a segment of those other stories that are the narratives of others' lives. We may thus consider nations, peoples, classes, communities of every sort as institutions that recognize themselves as well as others through narrative identity. It is in this sense that history, in the sense of historiography, can itself be taken as an institution destined to make manifest and to preserve the temporal dimension of the orders of recognition we have been considering. We now rejoin the properly ethical level of self-esteem. We have underscored its contribution to the constitution of a capable subject, capable essentially of ethico-juridical imputation. The intersubjective character of responsibility taken in this sense is evident. The example of promises will make it more comprehensible. The other is implicated here in multiple ways, as beneficiary, as witness, as judge, and, more fundamentally, as the one who, in counting on me, on my capacity to keep my word, calls me to responsibility, renders me responsible. The social bond instituted by contracts, by agreements of every sort, which give a juridical structure to the giving of one's word as an exchange, is intercalated within this structure of trust. The principle that agreements should be kept constitutes a rule of recognition that surpasses the face-to-face relation of the promise made between two people. This rule encompasses anyone who lives under the same laws, and, if we invoke international or humanitarian law, humanity as a whole. The other is no longer you, but the third party designated in a noteworthy way by the pronoun everyone, an impersonal but not anonymous pronoun. We have come to the point where politics appears as the setting par excellence for the achievement of human potentialities. The means by which it exercises this function are first set in place by what Hannah Arendt called the public space of appearance. This expression extends a theme originating in the Enlightenment, that of the publicity in the sense of the coming to light of day, without constraint, nor dissimulation, of the whole network of alliances within which each human life unfolds its brief history. This notion of a public space first expresses the condition of plurality resulting from the extension of interhuman relations to all those that the face-to-face relation of I and you leaves out as a third party. In turn, this condition of plurality characterizes the will to live together of a historical community of people, nation, region, class, and so forth, itself irreducible to interpersonal relations. In this sense, the political institution confers a distinct structure on this will to live together that earlier characterized all such systems as orders of recognition. Again, with Hannah Arendt, we can empower the common force that results from this will to live together, which only exists so long as this latter will is effective, as the terrifying experiences of defeat, where this bond is undone, give a negative proof. As the word indicates, political power is, across all the levels of power already considered, in continuity with the power by which I have characterized the capable human being. In return, It confers a perspective of endurance over time and of stability on this edifice of powers. More fundamentally, it projects the horizon of public peace understood as the tranquility of order. It is now possible to pose the question concerning what specific ethical values arise from this properly political level of the institution. We can answer, without hesitation, justice. Justice, John Rawls writes at the beginning of his theory of justice, is the first virtue of social institutions as truth is of systems of thought. But to what does justice stand in relation? Not to the you identifiable by your face, but rather to the everyone as third person. To each his own is its banner. The application to human interactions of the rule of justice presupposes that we can take society as a vast system of distribution, that is, of the sharing of roles, burdens, tasks, well beyond the distribution that takes place on the economic plane of market values. Justice, in this regard, has the same extension as do the orders of recognition we spoke of earlier. I shall not enter here into the discussion of the principle or principles of justice, which would take me far beyond my topic. I will stay instead with the question that began this investigation: who is the subject of rights? We have elaborated two responses. We have said, first, that the subject of rights is the same subject as the subject worthy of respect, and that this subject finds its definition on the anthropological plane in the enumeration of capacities attested to by the answers we give to a series of who questions culminating in the question to whom can human action be imputed. Next we have given a second response, according to which these capacities would remain virtual, even aborted or repressed, in the absence of interpersonal and institutional mediations, the state figuring a problematic place among these latter. The first response indicates the correctness of a certain liberal tradition in which the individual precedes the state. The rights attached to the capacities and potentialities we have spoken of constitute, in effect, the rights of humanity, in the precise sense of this term, that is, as rights attached to human beings as human beings and not as members of some political community conceived of as the source of positive rights. On the other hand, however, the ultra-individualistic version of liberalism is wrong to the extent that it misconceives the anthropological status of our power to speak, to act, to recount, to impute, in short, the fundamental and multiple icon of acting and suffering human existence, and claims to go directly to the actual accomplishments of individuals, which we can admit are contemporary with the positive rights of states. In conclusion, we can see the importance of the distinction between capacity and accomplishment. It governs the distinction between two versions of liberalism. According to one of them, which finds its most noteworthy expression in the tradition of the social contract, the individual is already a complete subject of rights before entering into the contractual relation. He gives up real rights that we can call natural rights in exchange for security, as with Hobbes, or for civil status or citizenship, as with Rousseau and Kant. At the same time, his association with other individuals in a political body is insecure and revocable. This is not the case for the other version of political liberalism, which is the one I prefer. Without institutional mediation, individuals are only the initial drafts of human persons. Their belonging to a political body is necessary to their flourishing as human beings, and in this sense, this mediation cannot be revoked. On the contrary, the citizens who issue from this institutional mediation can only wish that every human being should, like them, enjoy such political mediation, which when added to the necessary conditions stemming from a philosophical anthropology becomes a sufficient condition for the transition from the capable human being to the real citizen. The concept of responsibility. An essay in semantic analysis. This study is limited in its ambition. One have called it an essay in semantic analysis, or better, conceptual semantics in the sense Reinhard Koselleck gives this term in the field of history and historical knowledge. This essay is motivated by the sort of perplexity I was left with following an examination of the contemporary contextual uses of the term responsibility. On the one side, this concept seems well delimited in its classical juridical usage, in civil law, responsibility is defined by the obligation to make up or to compensate for the tort one has caused through one's own fault, and in certain cases determined by law, in penal law, by the obligation to accept punishment. We can see the place given to the idea of obligation, an obligation to compensate or to suffer punishment. A person subject to these obligations is someone who is responsible. All this seems clear enough. But, on the other side, or rather, from several other sides, a kind of vagueness invades the conceptual scene. In the first place, we are surprised that a term with such a firm sense on the juridical plane should be of such recent origin and not really well established within the philosophical tradition. Next, the current proliferation and dispersion of uses of this term is puzzling, especially because they go well beyond the limits established for its juridical use. The adjective responsible can complement a wide variety of things. You are responsible for the consequences of your acts, but also responsible for others' actions to the extent that they were done under your charge or care, and eventually far beyond even this measure. At the limit, you are responsible for everything and everyone. In these diffuse uses, the reference to obligation has not disappeared, it has become the obligation to fulfill certain duties, to assume certain burdens, to carry out certain commitments. In short, it is an obligation that overflows the framework of compensation and punishment. This overflowing is so forceful that it is under this meaning that the term imposes itself today on moral philosophy, to the point of occupying the whole terrain and of becoming for Hans Jonas, and to a large measure for Emmanuel Levinas, a principle. This overflowing runs in many directions, thanks to the chance assimilations encouraged by the polysemy of the verb to respond, not just in the sense of to answer for, but also as to respond to. But this is not all. On the properly juridical plane, beyond the extensions referred to above, aimed particularly at what others do or at what a thing under one's care may do, an extension more of the field of application than of the level of meaning, the juridical idea of responsibility is subject to the rivalry of opposed concepts, even newer than the concept under investigation. Mireille Delmas-Marty gives a good summary of these concepts at the beginning of her work Pour un droit commun, whether it be a question of danger, risk, or solidarity. To here then is how things lie: on the one side, a firmness in the juridical definition going back to the beginnings of the 19th century, on the other, an absence of attested philosophical ancestry for the same term, an overflowing and displacement of the center of gravity to the plane of moral philosophy, a lively competition among new candidates for the structuring function exercised until now by the concept of responsibility taken in the strict sense of an obligation to pay compensation or to undergo punishment. Faced with this situation, I propose the following strategy. In the next section, we shall seek, on the side leading to the classical juridical concept of responsibility, the ancestor or founding concept that has its particular place in moral philosophy under a name other than that of responsibility. Then, following from this, in a third section, we shall take account beyond the classical juridical concept of those filiations, derivations, even drifts that lead to the displacements in meaning referred to above in the current usage of the term responsibility, as well as the assaults on the properly juridical plane coming from newer rivals. The question in the next section will be to what extent this contemporary, apparently anarchic history will have been rendered intelligible by our investigation into this previous semantic filiation between imputation and retribution. The guiding idea in this elucidation of earlier developments is as follows. It is outside the semantic field of the verb to respond, whether it be a question of answering for or responding to, that we have to seek the founding concept. In fact, we must look in the semantic field of the verb to impute. A primitive relation to obligation resides within imputation, for which the obligation to compensate or to undergo punishment constitutes only a corollary or complement, which we can place under the generic term retribution. The term imputation was well known at a time when that of responsibility was not recognized as having a use outside political theory, where it was a question of the responsibility of the sovereign over against the British Parliament. This reference to an extrajuridical use is right uninteresting, inasmuch as the idea appears of giving an account, an idea whose place in the conceptual structure of imputation we shall consider below. This adjacent use of the term responsibility could play a role in the evolution that led to the concept of responsibility, taken in the juridical sense, becoming identified with the moral sense of imputation. But we have not yet reached that point. We need to grasp the concept of imputation in terms of its own structure before interpreting the back and forth exchanges between imputation and responsibility. To impute, say our best dictionaries, is to put on the account of someone a condemnable action, a fault, therefore an action initially marked by an obligation or a prohibition that this action infringes or breaks. The proposed definition allows us to see how, starting from the obligation or the prohibition regarding some action, and through the intervention first of an infraction, then of a reprobation, the judgment of imputation leads to that of retribution in the sense of an obligation to put things right or to suffer the penalty. But this movement that orients the judgment of imputation toward that of retribution must not lead us to overlook the inverse movement from retribution to the attribution of an action to its author. Therein lies the core of imputation. The Robert Dictionary cites in this regard an important text from 1771, to impute an action to someone is to attribute it to him as its actual author, to put it, so to speak, on his account and to make him responsible for it. This definition is worth noting insofar as it makes clear the derivation that leads from attribution to retribution. Let me emphasize this again, to attribute an action to someone as its actual author. We must not lose sight of this reference to an agent. But this is not the only noteworthy thing. The metaphor of an account put, so to speak, on his account is extraordinarily interesting. 3. It is not at all external to the judgment of imputation inasmuch as the Latin verb putere implies calculation, compute, suggesting the idea of a kind of moral bookkeeping of merits and demerits, as in a double-entry ledger, receipts and expenses, credits and debits, with an eye to a sort of positive or negative balance. The last offspring of this metaphor must be the very readable and physical demerit book all French drivers carry. In turn, this strange accounting suggests the idea of a kind of moral dossier, or record, as one says in English, a compendium for the inscription of debts and eventually of merits. Here again our French police record is very close to the idea of this strange dossier. In this way, we move back to the semi-mythical figures of the great book of debts, the book of life and death. This metaphor of a balance book seems to underlie the apparently banal idea of being accountable for, and the idea of giving an account, in the sense of reporting, recounting, at the end of a kind of reading of this strange summary dossier. 4. It is against the background of this turn of phrase within ordinary language, still rich with the metaphor of an account, that we have to set the attempts to fix the meaning of imputation conceptually. The contribution of the theology of the Reformation is enlightening in this regard. The key idea is not that of the imputation of a fault, or even of a merit, to the author of an action, but rather the gracious imputation of the merits of Christ, merits acquired on the cross, to the sinner who has faith in this sacrifice. The term imputation linked to the New Testament Greek logis tiei by way of the Latin imputere is in this way absorbed into the gravitational space of the doctrine of justification by faith. The radical basis for this lies in Christ's justitia aliena independent of any merit on the sinner's part. In truth, it would be necessary to go even further back, before Luther, to the nominalism of Occam and the doctrine of acceptio divina of John Duns Scotus and, still further, to St. Paul's interpretation of the faith of Abraham as found in Genesis 15:6, Abraham believed in God, and throughout this prehistory of the concept of imputation, the principal accent falls on the way in which God accepts the sinner in the name of his sovereign justice or righteousness. It was in this way that the concept of imputation was projected into the conceptual scene at the time of the theological conflicts of the 16th century, the Catholic Counter-Reformation rejecting the Lutheran doctrine of justification sola imputatione justitiae Christ. Nor should we overlook, from a neighboring order of ideas, in the attempts at a theodicy, the question of the imputation of evil. Having said this, it is a disputed question what the juridical notion of imputability owes to this theological context. The accent placed on capacity in the notion of Imputativitas translated into German by Imputabilität, then by Zurechnungsfähigkeit, or even Schuldfähigkeit suggests a recourse to the Aristotelian concept of a natural disposition, in a direction apparently opposed to Luther's forensic doctrine of justification. It does not seem illegitimate to take the doctrine of droit naturel de gens for a source not only independent of but antagonistic to the theological one. With Pufendorf, for example, the principal accent falls on the capacity of an agent and not on God's sovereign justice. 5. This notion of insurability in the sense of a capacity of imputation constitutes an indispensable key for comprehending the ultimate concern of Kant to preserve the double cosmological and ethical articulation of the term imputation, as a judgment of attribution to someone, as to its actual author, of a blameworthy action. The force of the idea of imputation in Kant consists in the conjunction of two more primitive ideas, the attribution of an action to an agent, and the moral and generally negative qualification of that action. The metaphysics of morals defines Zurechnung in the moral sense as the judgment by which someone is regarded as the originator. It is exactly to this central question that Rawls provides the strongest answer that has been offered in the present day. His goal is to resolve the problem left unsolved by Kant in his Ricoeur, how to pass from the first principle of morality, autonomy, understood in its etymological sense, namely, the freedom or he has insofar as one is rational to give oneself the law as the rule for the universalization of one's own maxims of action to the social contract by means of which a multitude abandons its external freedom in view of recovering it as a member of a republic. In other words, what is the connection between autonomy and the social contract? This connection is presupposed but not justified by Kant. If Rawls's undertaking is to succeed, we would then have to say that a purely procedural conception of justice can make sense without any presupposition concerning the good, and can even free the just from the tutelage of the good, first in what concerns institutions and then by implication in what concerns individuals and nation-states considered as individuals. In order to anticipate what will follow in our discussion, allow me to say that my principal objection will be to say that a moral sense of justice founded on the golden rule, do not do to others what you would not want to happen to you, is always presupposed by a purely procedural justification of the principle of justice. But we need to understand that this objection is not equivalent to a refutation of Rawls's theory of justice, something that would lack interest and would even be ridiculous. On the contrary, it leads to a kind of indirect defense of the primacy of this moral sense of justice, to the extent that Rawls's extraordinary construction borrows its underlying dynamic from the very principle it claims to engender by its purely contractual procedure. In other words, for me, the circularity of Rawls's argument constitutes an indirect plea in favor of the search for an ethical foundation for the concept of justice. Consequently, it is the circularity that will be at stake throughout my investigation of Rawls's theory of justice. That his theory of justice posits the primacy of the just over the good is both clear and openly admitted by Rawls. That revival of the contractualist tradition assures this primacy by equating the just with a procedure specifically held to be fair, that is, equitable, is what we need now to demonstrate. The important thing to say at the beginning is that the whole of Rawls's theory is directed against another version of the teleological conception of justice, namely, the utilitarianism that has predominated over the past 2 centuries in the English-speaking world, and that finds its most eloquent advocates in John Stuart Mill and Henry Sidgwick. This point must not be forgotten in the following discussion. When Rawls speaks of a teleological approach, he is not thinking of Plato or Aristotle, who provide little more than the occasion for a few footnotes, but rather the utilitarian conception of justice. Utilitarianism is a teleological doctrine inasmuch as it defines justice by the maximization of the good for the greatest number. As applied to institutions, this doctrine is merely the extrapolation of a principle of choice constructed at the level of the individual, according to which a simple pleasure or an immediate satisfaction ought to be sacrificed to the benefit of a greater but more distant satisfaction. We shall see below in what way Rawls's second principle of justice is diametrically opposed to this utilitarian version of justice. To maximize the minimal share in a situation of unequal shares, a rule called maximin differs completely from the rule of maximizing the interest of the greatest number. The first idea that comes to mind is that there is an ethical moat between the teleological conception of utilitarianism and the general deontological conception. In extrapolating from the individual to the social whole as utilitarianism does, the notion of sacrifice takes on considerable weight. It is no longer a private pleasure that is sacrificed, but a whole social layer. Utilitarianism, as one French disciple of René Girard, Jean-Pierre Dupuy, puts it, tacitly implies a sacrificial principle that is equivalent to legitimating the strategy of the scapegoat. The Kantian reply would be that the least favored in an unequal division of advantages must not be sacrificed because he is a person, which is a way of saying that according to the sacrificial principle the potential victim of some distribution would be treated as a means and not as an end in himself. In a sense, this is also Rawls's conviction, as I shall attempt to show below. But if it is his conviction, it is not his argument. And this is what counts. His book as a whole is an attempt to shift the question of grounds to the profit of a question about mutual agreement, which is the central theme of every contractualist theory of justice. Rawls's theory of justice is undoubtedly deontological insofar as it is opposed to the teleological approach of utilitarianism, but it is a deontology without a transcendental foundation. Why? Because it is the function of the social contract to derive the contents of the principle of justice from a fair procedure without any commitment regarding the objective criteria of the just, at the price, according to Rawls, of ultimately reintroducing some presuppositions concerning the good. The declared goal of a theory of justice is to give a procedural solution to the question of the just. A fair procedure in view of a just arrangement of institutions. This is exactly what is signified by the title of Chapter 1, Justice as Fairness. Fairness, in the first place, characterizes the procedure of deliberation that should lead to the choice of those principles of justice recommended by Rawls, whereas justice designates the content of the chosen principles. In this way, the whole book aims at providing a contractual version of Kantian autonomy. For Kant, the law is the law freedom would give itself if it could remove itself from the inclination of desires and of pleasure. For Rawls, a just institution would be one that a plurality of reasonable and disinterested individuals would choose if they could deliberate in a situation that would itself be fair, a position whose condition and constraints we shall consider in a moment. But first, I want to emphasize that the major slant of this book is to substitute as far as possible a procedural solution for a foundational solution to the question of the just, whence the constructivist, even artificial turn the book shares with the rest of the contractualist tradition. When the just is subordinated to the good, it has to be discovered; when it is engendered by purely procedural means, it has to be constructed. It is not known in advance. It is supposed to result from deliberation in a condition of absolute fairness. In order to dramatize what is at stake, I want to suggest that justice as procedural fairness aims at resolving Rousseau's well-known paradox of the legislator. We read in the social contract, discovering the rules of society best suited to nations would require a superior intelligence that beheld all the passions of men without feeling any of them, who had no affinity with our nature, yet knew it through and through, whose happiness was independent of us, yet who nevertheless was willing to concern itself with ours, finally, who, in the passage of time, procures for himself a distant glory, being able to labor in one age and find enjoyment in another. Gods would be needed to give men laws. 2. Justice as fairness can be understood as the earthly solution to this paradox. This formidable ambition may explain the fascination Rawls's work has exercised for over 20 years on both its friends and its enemies. Following this long introduction, I propose to consider the answers Rawls gives to the following three questions. I. What assures the fairness in the situation of deliberation from which an agreement may result concerning a just arrangement of institutions? To this question corresponds the imagination of the original position and the well-known allegory that accompanies it, that of the veil of ignorance. 2. What principles will be chosen behind the veil of ignorance? The answer to this question is to be found in the description and interpretation of the two principles of justice and their being set in the correct order. 3. What argument ought to convince the deliberating parties to unanimously choose the Rawlsian principles of justice instead of, say, some variation of utilitarianism? The answer lies in the so-called Maximin argument borrowed from game theory and transposed from its initial application on the economic plane. Only after having presented these three cardinal theses in as neutral a manner as possible will we be ready to return to the philosophical question posed above, namely, whether and to what extent a purely procedural conception of justice can be substituted for an ethical foundation of our socio-political sense of justice. The original position. As already stated, an agreement is fair if the starting point is fair. Consequently, justice understood as fairness rests on the fairness of what Rawls calls the original situation or position. Two things need to be said at the outset. First, this situation or position is not historical, but hypothetical, or imaginary. Thus we are to imagine that those who engage in social cooperation choose together, in one joint act, the principles which are to assign basic rights and duties and to determine the division of social benefits. I shall return in the following section to the underlying conception of social justice as a process or a procedure of distribution indicated by the terms assign and determine the division. Here I want to accentuate the fact that we are to imagine. This leads me to my second introductory remark. In justice as fairness, the original position of equality corresponds to the state of nature in the traditional theory of the social contract. In fact, the original position is substituted for the state of nature inasmuch as it is a position of equality. We recall that for Hobbes the state of nature was characterized as the war of each against all and, as Leo Strauss emphasizes, as a state wherein everyone is motivated by the fear of a violent death. What is at stake for Hobbes is not justice, but security. Rousseau and Kant, without sharing Hobbes' pessimistic anthropology, describe the state of nature as one without law, that is, with no power that can arbitrate among opposed claims. On the other hand, the principles of justice can become the contents of a common choice if and only if the original position is a fair one. But it can be fair in this sense only in a purely hypothetical situation. Discerning the constraints the original position has to fulfill, in order to be held equal in every respect, calls for a great deal of speculation, which finds its intuitive support in the fable of the veil of ignorance to which Rawls owes much of his reputation. The idea can be expressed as follows. Among the essential features of this situation is that no one knows his place in society, his class position or social status, nor does anyone know his fortune in the distribution of natural assets and abilities, his intelligence, strength, and the like. I shall even assume that the parties do not know their conceptions of the good or their special psychological propensities. We might think that this imaginary state of ignorance reintroduces something like Kant's transcendental will, which is also independent of any empirical ground and, as a result, of any reference to ends or values. In short, it is denuded of any teleological implication. But this assimilation is mistaken. According to Rawls, the subject has earthly interests but does not know what they will turn out to be. We could speak in this regard of an intermediate philosophical position between transcendentalism and empiricism, which does not make it easy to give an exact description of what Rawls means by the original position. This opacity is reflected principally in the answers Rawls gives to the question of just what individuals must know behind the veil of ignorance so that the choice will bear on actual earthly things, that is, not just on rights and duties, but on the distribution of social benefits. In other words, to the degree that the choice has to do with interests in conflict, the participants placed behind the veil of ignorance must have some knowledge of what it means to be interested. In effect, there is a problem of justice as soon as an appropriate division of social advantages at issue. Hence those involved must be not just free and rational persons, but persons concerned to advance their own interests. Whence the first constraint imposed on the original position, namely, that each participant should have a sufficient knowledge of the general psychology of humanity as regards its basic passions and motivations. Rawls frankly recognizes that his philosophical anthropology is very close to that of Hume's treatise of human nature as regards needs, interests, ends, and conflicting claims, including the interests of a self that regards its conception of the good as worthy of recognition and that advances claims in its behalf as deserving satisfaction. Rawls calls these constraints the circumstances of justice. Second, the participants must know what every reasonable being is presumed likely to want to possess, namely, those primary social goods without which the exercise of liberty would be an empty demand. In this regard, it is important to note that self-respect belongs to the list of primary goods. In this way, a purely deontological approach to the notion of justice is not stripped of teleological considerations, since these are already present in the original situation. In the original situation, individuals do not know what will be their own conception of the good, but they do know that humans prefer to have more rather than less primary social goods. Third, the choice being among different conceptions of justice, the participants deliberating behind the veil of ignorance must have suitable formation concerning the competing principles of justice. They have to know utilitarian arguments and, ironically, they have to know the Rawlsian principles of justice, since the choice is not between particular laws but between global conceptions of justice. This is why in Rawls's work the principles of justice are described and interpreted before the thematic treatment of the original position. The alternatives open to persons in the original position have to be presented in detail and with all their applications. The contract consists precisely in ranking the alternative theories of justice. This is not all. Rawls also wants to add what he calls the formal constraints of the concept of right, that is, the constraints that hold for every ethical choice and not just for those of justice. Publicity is the most important of these. We shall see below that utilitarianism does not allow for this kind of transparency insofar as the sacrificial principle it implies must remain hidden and not public. Because all the participants must be equal in terms of information, the presentation of alternatives and arguments must be public. Another constraint is what Rawls calls the stability of the contract, that is, the anticipation that it will be binding in real life, whatever the prevailing circumstances. 3. To sum up, the veil of ignorance has a basic purpose, namely, to set up a fair procedure so that any principles agreed to will be justi. The aim is to use the notion of pure procedural justice as a basis of theory. This connection between the imagination of the veil of ignorance and the search for a purely procedural conception of justice must not be underestimated. Procedural justice constitutes a full-blown alternative to substantive justice governed by shared presuppositions concerning the common good. Procedural justice is justice inasmuch as behind the veil of ignorance the effects of specific contingencies are nullified. The veil of ignorance assures the fairness of the starting situation. Hence the argument continues, since the differences among the parties are unknown to them, and everyone is equally rational and similarly situated, each is convinced by the same arguments. Furthermore, if anyone after due reflection prefers a conception of justice to another, then they all do, and a unanimous agreement can be reached. So, in the original situation there is a perfect equation between anyone and everyone. What principles of justice would be chosen? Behind the veil of ignorance. Before considering in detail the precise formulation of the two principles of justice, let me make two general comments concerning the subject of justice. First comment: justice is not initially an intersubjective virtue, one governing bilateral relations, rather, it governs institutions, Jews. Tis is the first virtue of social institutions, as truth is of systems of thought. This opening assertion seems to fit more with the Platonic conception of justice than with that of Aristotle. Justice is a virtue of the whole, for Plato has been taken as one of the most brilliant rebuttals yet offered of John Rawls and of his abstract, formal, and strictly procedural concept of justice. The second is that which Luc Boltanski and Laurent Thévenot present in their De la Justification, Les économies de la grandeur. In this book, it is the idea of justification and not directly that of justice that provides the focus, while it is the cities and worlds governed by what the subtitle calls economies of scale or standing that introduce plurality at the very heart of the demand for justification. The target is no longer Rawls's procedural abstraction, but rather the apparent antinomy between the holism of Durkheimian sociologists and the methodological individualism professed by economic theory. It remains true, however, that these two works, despite their differences, both deal with a pluralism that takes up in an inverted fashion, so to speak, the unitary focus on the judicial that the nation-state constitutes in our Western and more precisely our Republican tradition. There is one pitfall I wish to avoid, that of a term-by-term comparison ending up with a mere juxtaposition of these two short monographs. Beyond the difference in the way of dividing what are here called spheres and cities, I want to consider two questions. The first has to do with the different nature of these projects and the criteria of distinction that result from this. The second, and more important, question, although governed by the first, concerns the new possibilities for regrouping the political community and its justice left open by these two enterprises of what we can call juridical pluralism. Indeed, if these two works invert our republican conception of the oneness of the source of juridicity, summed up by the concept of the sovereignty of the people, do they not invite us to take them in turn in an inverted manner by asking what there is to say, in the last analysis, about justice or justification as singular terms at the end of the long detour through multiplicity and the diversity of sources of right? Approaching these two works beginning from the projects that set them on their way and the criteria of distinction that flow from these projects, we must first attend to the differences expressed in their subtitles. On the one side, defense of pluralism and equality, on the other, the economies of grandeur. What does this say? Walzer's project has to do with equality. But the criterion of differentiation is provided by the notion of social goods. Thus it is necessary to examine the nature of this connection. Ever since Solon, Pericles, Isocrates, and Aristotle, equality has been a synonym of justice. Once justice is held to govern the distribution of equal or unequal shares, in the varying senses I shall speak of as qualitative. Let us say that justice, in a distributive sense, identifies the idea of equality with that of a fair share. Difficulties begin when one sets aside simple equality, arithmetic equality. Aristotle said following the formula, the same share to everyone. Only a repressive society, it is said, could impose such equality, and it would be to everyone's detriment. So what then of complex equality? The demand for such equality turns out to be essentially reactive or corrective, not to say abolitionist. What one wants to abolish is domination. Whence Walzer's project, the aim of political egalitarianism is a society free from domination. The same applies, as we shall see, for Boltanski and Thévenot. But how does domination manifest itself in our societies? Essentially in the way social goods are distributed. What can we do so that no social good serves as a means of domination? With this question we tie the project to its criterion, namely, the principle of differentiation of social goods. Three interconnected assertions serve as a guide here. Social goods are irreducibly multiple, 2 each one rests on some symbolism, and 3 each develops an internal logic, on the basis of the shared understanding of the groups in question, that is, the reasons that govern both the extent of its validity and the limit of the claim it makes. These 3 assertions give us a threefold criterion for identifying the goods at issue, differentiating the implied symbolism in each case, and delimiting the concerned spheres. Thus we can see how the project to counteract domination and the threefold criterion bound to the notion of social goods are articulated in terms of each other. The notion of complex equality then appears as the concept resulting from the intersection between the project of combating domination and the program of differentiating spheres of justice. Like the idea of simple equality, that of complex equality is a concept of protest, of abolition. From this, we can already presume that the concern for differentiation will win out over that of integration. But this will be the theme of the next section of this chapter. If we now look at the open-ended list of social goods Walzer proposes, we are struck by several surprising features. My first impress. Zion is one of bric-a-brac of bricolage in the sense made famous by Claude Lévi-Strauss. This effect is undeniably the one sought. If it is true that social goods are heterogeneous, the reasons that govern their evaluation are themselves incommensurable. A rapid glance at the list confirms this. We begin with membership. How is the inside and outside of a political community to be assigned between members and strangers? We continue with social provision, essentially security and assistance to those most in need, with the question what needs entail an obligation that they be provided for, along with a corresponding right to such provision. From there we pass on to money and commodities, with the question what can and cannot be bought with money. As complete a list as possible of what is not commercial answers this question. Therefore it is by considering the legitimate meanings attached to the notion of saleable goods that the limits attached to the notion of the market and to that of a market economy are decided. Next considered are offices open to rule-governed competitions, with a cluster of questions: what tests? Who judges? And above all, is every job to be considered an office? The whole question of a right to and the limits of the notion of public service in office are at issue here. This, curiously, is followed by the question of hard, degrading, or dangerous work, all taken to be negative values that need to be fairly distributed without regimenting the whole world. From here we pass to leisure activities, which, as positive, do not reduce to idleness, or vacations, but preside over the distribution of social time and the rhythms of activity in the city. It is not surprising next to read many pages devoted to education, which is a social good inasmuch as the transmission of knowledge and the formation of personal autonomy are traceable back to social symbolism. A string of questions touching on justice flows from the understanding of this good: who teaches? To whom? Under the control of what offices? And above all, how to assure equality of opportunity, without falling on and again into repressive systems through an excess of pedagogical zeal? The reader, educated in political philosophy, will be astonished to turn next to 3 chapters devoted to kinship and love, divine grace, and the struggle for recognition. This is another occasion to say that the list of social goods is long and open-ended, as soon as one takes into account the amplitude of shared symbolisms, the internal logic of the goods considered, and above all the delimitation that results from their spheres of validity. Who can deny that kinship, marriage, and the equality of the sexes pose questions of distribution? Or that the quarrel between church and state calls for the curbing of rival pretensions, raised in turn by one side or the other across a line of demarcation bought at a high price? Finally, recognition itself is a social good in the form of titles, honors, compensations, and prizes, but also punishments. What we distribute to one another is esteem, not self-esteem; respect, not self-respect; defeat, not the sense of defeat, and the relation of the first to the second term in each of these pairs is indirect and uncertain. We see that the notion of social goods extends far, even to the sphere of intimacy, and the problems of a just distribution pursue us to the very core of our conscience. But we come to the last chapter, whose place in the whole edifice, or rather in its enumeration, will be at the center of our critical reflections when we come in the next section to ask ourselves about the resources for another grouping left open by one or the other of the juridical pluralisms we are considering. This last chapter is titled Political Power, it is worth noting that in it we find no definition in the form of a state, even though we find enumerated sovereignty, authority, and the power of decision-making. It is as one good among goods, therefore as a distributed good, that political power is sought and feared and resisted. If this is the case, it is because no other good poses in such a critical manner the problem of boundaries. Sometimes it is colonized by money, by the competence of experts, even by sex; sometimes it invades all the other spheres, to the point of giving tyranny its most visible form. How is it to be kept within its boundaries? Well, by proceeding as in the case of money, where it was asked what cannot be bought thanks to the internal logic of commercial goods. In the same way, one makes a list of what we cannot do with political power: tolerate slavery, corrupt the system of justice, discriminate among plaintiffs, control religion, confiscate or abusively tax property, arrogate to ourselves the monopoly of education, restrain basic liberties. For Walzer, this question about what political power can and cannot do precedes and commands the question of who governs. Taking up the much-used metaphor of the captain of the ship, he forthrightly proclaims that it is up the passengers, not the captain, to choose the destination and evaluate the risks. Here Walzer is close to Hannah Arendt, for whom power proceeds from the conjunction of wills and not from any higher agency. In this regard, the most important peril for our societies comes from the coalition between property as power over things and political power as exercised over human beings. Whence the permanent urgency of a correct delimitation of spheres. Still the reader cannot fail to wonder, is political power a good like all the others? As the crucial agency of distributive justice, is it not itself also the border guard? And, in this, does it not pose a quite specific problem of self-limitation, whether by constitutional or some other means? We touch here on what I shall call below the political paradox, namely that politics seems both to constitute one sphere of justice among others and to envelop all the other spheres. Turning from Walzer to Boltanski and Thévenot, we are immediately struck by the difference not only at the level of their project but also in the criteriology that results from it. To the pair formed by the search for complex equality and the investigation of social goods corresponds another pairing, that between the search for justification and the investigation of orders of scale. These massive differences refer back to different initial situations. For Walzer, this is tyranny, the perverse form of domination. For Boltanski and Thévenot, it is conflict, disputes, differences of opinion, in short, discord. Domination calls for a curbing strategy, discord one of justification consisting of a battery of arguments intended to prevail in disputes or litigation. When so associated with the search for justification, the sense of injustice constitutes a motivation within the framework of disagreement no less strong than it does within that of domination. For it is violence that haunts discord once this fails to raise itself to the level of discourse. This then is the question from which this work proceeds, how to justify agreement and manage disagreement without succumbing to violence. This project makes use of a methodology, or better a criteriology, consisting, as in the case of Walzer, of a work of differentiation. This is why an identical problem of redistribution will be considered below. However, differentiation does not bear here on social goods and shared understanding, but on principles of scale. The difference is not easy to make clear. Let us say that one starts by looking for forms of equivalence and therefore generalities among social actors, resulting from their recourse to final principles of legitimation in situations of agreement and disagreement. It is these principles that turn out in the end to be multiple. It is necessary to stop somewhere in the regression toward always prior arguments. The necessity for such a halt in operations of justification cannot fail to interest the jurist reflecting on the relationship between judgment and stopping point, stop in deliberation, stop in the confrontation of claims, a final word pronounced in the debate of oneself with oneself or between oneself and another. But this is not all. We have not yet introduced the idea of scale or of an economy of scale. Orders of generality corresponding to forms of justification are not just a means of classification, but also scales of evaluation. Think of Pascal and his established scales our authors have. That principles of justification govern relations of standing becomes obvious once the idea of justification takes over in determining what counts or does not count in qualifying tests. Here is what for Boltanski and Thévenot occupies the place held for Walzer by the idea of a heterogeneity of social goods, namely, the plurality of principles of justification invoked when social actors undertake to plead for their cause or to uphold their criticism in situations of discord. I do not want to push this opposition too far, for didactic reasons. There is a kinship between these two projects of pluralizing the idea of justice that brings them close together. We can show this by the implicit borrowings each makes from the other. For example, the notion of social goods develops an internal logical heavily freighted with a prescriptive load. In this sense, the notion of a shared understanding links up with that of justification. In an opposite sense, we can say that scales of standing give rise to distributions just like that of social goods. Justification too then has to do with distributive justice. What is more, in both cases it is power, and therefore also satisfaction and enjoyment, that gets distributed. It is true, however, that the gap remains between a project aimed at equality, that is, at the limitation of domination, and one aimed at justification, that is, at a reasonable treatment of opposing claims. This initial difference finds an echo on the plane of the models with which the two enterprises end up. It is not by chance that Boltanski and Thevenot call into question not spheres of justice but cities and worlds. Regimes of justified action can be called cities insofar as they give some sufficient coherence to an order of human transactions. They are worlds insofar as some things, objects or arrangements serve as established referents, something like a common world, for tests that occur within a given city. Thus, in the inspired city, the standing of persons is authorized by grace or a gift, with no relation to money, glory, or utility. In the city of opinion, standing depends on renown, on the opinion of others. In the commercial city, it is rare goods, submitted to everyone's envy, that are negotiated, people being united only through the agreement they find in their desires. In the domestic city, which extends to include what Hannah Arendt called the household, the values of loyalty, fidelity, and reverence reign. The civic city rests on the subordination of one's own interest to the will of the whole, expressed in positive law. In the industrial city, which is not to be confused with the commercial city where the instantaneous fixing of prices is what is operative, what dominates are long-standing functional rujabes submitted to the higher principle of utility. The first striking thing is the superficial resemblance between these two works. The chapter on the commercial city recalls that on money and commodities, the civic city evokes political power, and one could easily find equivalencies between what is said on the one hand about the inspired city, and on the other about divine grace, or between the domestic city and free time, recognition, and so on. But we can doubt whether such a term-by-term correlation gets us very far, given that the methodology used differs so profoundly. Walser draws on a cultural anthropology in the eyes of which the evaluation of social goods presents an enduring relative stability. In this, he proceeds as does Clifford Geertz in his Understanding of Cultures. He confines himself to telling examples as a way of presenting the profiles of relatively stable and enduring evaluations. It is the idea of shared understandings that allows this procedure to work, which, after all, was already that of Max Weber with his elaboration of ideal types. Boltanski and Thevenot's cities are not ideal types of shared evaluations but rather forms of argumentation in situations of agreement and disagreement. This is why their reconstruction has to be more complex than a mere redoubling of the understandings effectively at work over a sufficiently long period. They consist curiously and, may I say, happily in a direct confrontation, with a view to clarifying them in terms of one another, of, on the one hand, speculative works received from the philosophical and theological tradition, and, on the other hand, training manuals intended for the managers of enterprises and for union leaders. This intersecting reading is first put into practice in the setting of the commercial city. Our authors extract from Adam Smith the elements that assure the establishment of a commercial bond. These elements constitute, as Smith expresses it, the outlines of a grammar it is possible to identify in the weakest, least articulated of arguments, like those in the already mentioned training manuals. In the same way, Augustine's City of God is asked to bring to an appropriate level the weaker discourse articulated by spiritual guidebook authors, popular artists, and other marginal talents who people the inspired city. Rousseau's social contract is, as might be expected, the major resource for the civic city. Hobbes's conception of honor helps make explicit the subtle rules of hierarchy in the city of renown, where standing depends entirely on others' opinion. Saint Simon is the guide for making use of the discourse of those he was the first to call industrialists. Bossuet and other moralists provide a discourse appropriate to the domestic city. The advantage of the methodology at work in the justification is to push much further the conceptual analysis that in Walzer is taken for granted, once the symbolism governing a category of social goods has been established. I want to show this in regard to two subdivisions where these two works seem to overlap, the commercial and the political bonds. As regards the commercial bond, Walzer, who is essentially concerned to prevent one sphere from reaching into another, confines himself to a brief summary of what sharing, buying and selling, and exchanging can signify. He counts on a kind of clarifying intuition, applied to the internal logic of the goods under consideration, in order to make up his list of what cannot be bought or sold. In the end, it is by composing the list of items having to do with other categories of goods that one specifies, in a negative sort of way, the commercial good itself. In the law justification, a work of constitution based on a type of argumentation that is more evaluative of the commercial bond itself corresponds to this operation of marking things. We can even speak of a veritable constitution of a common good that leads individuals to surpass their singularity. I shall return in the next part to the role played by this notion of a common good, which our authors specify in each case in terms of the city under consideration. Thus, in the case of the commercial city, the common good is figured by the price that concludes the negotiation sparked off by the free play of desire for coveted things. The commercial bond unites persons through the intermediary of scarce goods open to the appetites of all, and the competition of desires subordinates the price, attached to the possession of a good, to the desires of others. It is clear therefore that it is the rules governing the market rules, the authors say, similar to rules of grammar that allow, secondarily, criticism of the pretension of the commercial sphere to contaminate all the other spheres. This example of the commercial city provides a good occasion for refining the difference between an evaluative approach and an argumentative one, whatever their undeniable kinship may be. I would like now to consider the other register where the two analyses overlap, political power on the one hand, the civic city on the other. For Walzer, we have seen, the question of power touches closely on the major preoccupation of his book, namely, the fate of domination. We have equally seen that it is in discovering the list of what political power does not have the right to control that we outline the contours of the sphere of power. But this internal constitution is taken as already understood, whereas with Boltanski and Thevenot the social contract gives rise to a conceptual genesis, namely, the one that proceeds from the transference of sovereignty from the body of the king to the general will. This is the case of a kind of subordination where the common good is defined as a public good. Degrees of civic standing proceed from the reciprocal commitment between particular individuals and the general public. Depending on whether the will that makes citizens act is singular or, on the contrary, turned toward the general interest. It is at this point that the analysis of the civic city leads to the same perplexities as does that of the sphere of political power. Is the civic city the very oddness of this term ought already to alert us a city like all others? Is its paradox not that it also envelopes all the other cities? This perplexity will be at the center of the second part of this chapter. But I want to say a few more words about the difference in strategy in these two books. This is all the more necessary once Boltanski and Thevenot complete their theory of cities with that of worlds. Allow me to recall how our authors pass from the first to the second theme. The attention paid to the grammar that is constitutive of each city has to be accompanied by attention to the ways in which the qualification of persons of this or that standing are tested. I will underline in passing the importance for jurists of the moment of judgment, which is the moment when a ruling that decides a dispute is given, ending any incertitude concerning the standing of the parties involved. What is important for our present analysis lies elsewhere, however. This is the use made of a basis in things, objects, states of affairs in those qualifying tests that authorize us to speak not just of cities but also of worlds. From justice, say our authors, the question of agreement thus leads to that of adjustment. It is perhaps this attention to material states of affairs, comparable to the judicial apparatus of the tribunal, that most distances our authors from the phenomenology of shared symbolism and commits them instead to a criteriology of judgment under the heading of tested judgment 3. This is the part of Boltanski and Thévenot's work that runs the greatest risk of being overlooked. Yet it is here that our author's approach is most clearly distinguished from that of Walzer. The passage from the idea of a city to that of a world allows, in effect, for verifying the grammar of works of political philosophy with the aid of forms of discourse that come closest to the actual practice of those training manuals destined for managers and union leaders, as guidebooks for real worlds. However, rather than prolonging this confrontation on the plane of the realization of these two projects which differ so in where they begin, let us now turn toward the critical question posed at the beginning of this lecture. What resources for grouping the political body, and hence for unifying different foci of right, remain open when we come to the end of our reading of these books? We cannot say that Walzer's book is completely lacking any encompassing aim. The theme of complex equality, a theme reckoned to be abolitionist and the polar opposite of domination, runs through very sphere. It is, if I may so put it, what holds everything together. This theme already appears in the subtitle, A Defense of Plurality and Equality. Let us understand this to mean pluralism at the service of complex equality. And let us recall the formula already quoted from Spheres of Justice: the aim of political egalitarianism is a society free from domination. With this theme, Walzer can enter into competition with Rawls at the level of Rawls's second principle of justice. More fundamentally, it is what authorizes preserving, in the very title of the book, the word justice in the singular. Everything that is subsequently said about domination stems from what we can call a minimal formalism, which is expressed in the working definitions of terms like monopoly, domination, dominance, or finally tyranny. This minimal formalism is further expressed in the correlation between the abolitionist project and the criteriology of social goods. In this respect, we can take as a formal feature the threefold criterion: heterogeneity of social goods, shared symbolism, and internal logic of the prescriptive import. But I want to emphasize a concept we have not yet considered, which is situated at the point of encounter between the project of differentiation and the criteriology drawn from the notion of social goods, the concept of conversion, and with it of convertibility. Conversion consists in the fact that a social good, let us say money, wealth, gets set up as a function of its value in another sphere of justice, say that of political power. Here is the ultimate secret of the phenomenon of dominance, defined as a way of using social goods that isn't limited by their intrinsic meanings or that shapes those meanings in its own image. Conversion can thus be characterized as a kind of symbolic violence. For as Walzer states, a dominant good is converted into another good, into many others, in accordance with what often appears to be a natural process but is in fact magical, a kind of social alchemy. This surprising text makes me think of the famous chapter in Capital devoted to the fetishism of merchandise, merchandise being given a kind of mystical grandeur thanks to a fusion of the economic and the religious. Walzer will refer to conversion a number of times, but leave it, without further reflection, its metaphorical status. But it is not nothing if we admit, with Walzer, that we can characterize whole societies in terms of the patterns of conversion that are established within them. And again, history reveals no single dominant good and no naturally dominant good, but only different kinds of magic and competing bands of magicians. Walzer's reticence to say more stems from the major stance in his book, which is vigilance over the frontiers, as though the concern to found or integrate the most far-reaching social bond blocked us from the task of combating monopolies and tyrannies, as though every foundational enterprise were condemned to play the perfidious magical game of conversion. Yet can a theory exclusively concerned to differentiate spheres avoid the question of integration of these same spheres into a single political body? It is not that Walzer is unaware of this question. At the very moment he puts in place his argument, he declares, the political community is the appropriate setting for this enterprise. But nowhere does the status of this setting become the object of a distinct reflection. This reticence explains certain anomalies in the treatment of the first and last spheres of justice, nationality and political power. As regards the first sphere of justice, we must observe that all the other distributions of goods unfold within it. Nationality is not a social good like the others, we don't distribute it among ourselves, it is already ours. We give it out to strangers. And again, membership cannot be handed out by some external agency, its value depends upon an internal decision. In other words, here we run up against a phenomenon of self-constitution that is difficult to place under the aegis of distribution, except through the bias of a pairing. Citizen-foreigner. The unusual character of this phenomenon of self-constitution in relation to an idea of distributive justice is underscored again by the fact that almost all other social goods turn out to be goods that cross frontiers, for which the world constitutes the final distributive agency about which we say that it is self-contained. In contrast, we have to say that the political community is probably the closest we can come to a world of common meanings. Reading the last chapter, which in a way corresponds in a polar manner to the first one, reinforces our difficulty. As I said at the end of the first section of this chapter, political power is both a shared good like the others and if we are careful to watch over it the guardian of the frontiers. But it soon becomes clear that what interests Walzer is not the status of popular sovereignty and its eventual indivisibility, hence the foundation of the political body, which would touch the very question of the source of right, but the likelihood of what has appeared to us as the major perversion of the process of evaluating goods, namely, the unwarranted conversion of one good into another, of wealth into political power, of political power into religious power, and so on. In this way the question of the unitary ground of the political body is avoided. At the same time, this work also avoids confronting the political paradox that is constituted by treating the state in terms of distributive justice. As a good to be distributed, political power has to be given its place among all other goods. This is a way of contributing to demystifying it. But, insofar as it is not just one good among others, insofar as it is what regulates different distributions, including those having to do with such incorporeal commodities as affective, mystical, and ethico-juridical goods, political power seems to overflow the framework of distributive justice and to pose the specific problem of its self-constitution and, correlative to this, of its self-limitation. Why does Walzer avoid posing the problem of the state and of sovereignty in terms of this paradox? Undoubtedly he would say that this problem has been dealt with so often that today it covers over the one that seems more urgent to him, the problem of a limited government. Thus his argument is not really with Rawls, on the point of the principles of justice, but with Nozick, on the point of minimal government. He is like the firefighter who runs to where the fire is where there is a transgression of some frontier. And the peril is greatest in his eyes with the question of political power. Yet we may suspect that there is a more basic reason at work here. A political philosophy constructed entirely around the theme of the heterogeneity of social goods is poorly armed to pose the problem of the self-constitution of the political body along with the connected problems of its self-limitation. So the question arises whether a theory of justification, concerned for its part to differentiate cities and worlds, is better prepared to confront this figure of the political paradox. As a first approximation, one could say that Boltanski and Thévenot's book is better prepared than is Walzer's to take up such all-encompassing considerations. Long analyses devoted successively to the figures of criticism in situations of disagreement, then to that particular form of a return to agreement constituted by a compromise, can be seen as responding to the theme of complex equality. This order of succession is important. We do not go directly to the possibilities of agreement on the scale of a unified political community. First we make a long detour through the conflict between different worlds. The two works certainly resemble each other in this way. From both sides, pluralism can lead to the beginning of a tragic vision of action, agreement in one city having as its price disagreement between cities. But what Walzer treats as a conflict between shared symbolic systems, in the extension of the heterogeneity of goods, Boltanski and Thévenot deal with as a conflict between principles of justification, hence as an exercise in criticism. The transfer from one world to another is characterized by a transfer of arguments capable of sapping from within the principles of scale of this or that city, submitted in this way to the fire of a suspicious judgment. This capacity for mutual challenges is structural and not accidental. The common good of one city is vulnerable to the critique provided by the vision of another common good that accounts for the common bond of another city. In this way, our authors are led to lay out the map of intersecting critiques leading from one world toward each of the 5 other worlds. I shall not go into detail here about the crossfire that results, wherein there are many missed shots. Instead, I shall dwell upon one remark that will lead us directly to the question of compromise, where the overall significance of the work is finally at issue. There exists no overarching position, external to and above each of these worlds, from which the plurality of justices could be considered from on high, like a range of equally possible choices. The absence of any overarching position is a major theme common to both these books. What is the result for a theory of compromise? Does this offer new openings for a recomposition of a unitary idea of justice? Let us first observe, as a kind of transition, that the critique exercised starting from one world toward others is carried out by people capable of changing worlds, and therefore of transporting with them the internal vision of the world from which they come. An implicit trickster theory is thereby presumed. It is the defector, the traitor, that allows our authors to write, the possibility of leaving the present situation and denouncing it by basing oneself on an external principle and, consequently, a plurality of worlds, constitutes therefore the condition for a justified action. But is not this individual who goes over the wall, so to speak, moved by the vision of a common good that is not just that of one city, of one world? This is the question that is finally at issue for this whole enterprise. And it is difficult to answer either yes or no to this question. At the very beginning of the book, still at a very formal level before we enter into the maze of cities, somewhat like when Walzer speaks of domination before beginning his tour of his spheres, our authors set out a series of axioms that directly anticipate the answer to our question. The first axiom is constituted by the principle of the common humanity of all members of any city. This equalizes every human being as human, excluding in particular any slavery or any category of subhumans. But in the absence of any differentiation, this bond remains non-political inasmuch as it only brings on stage a single man, an Adam. Eden is not a political setting. The perpetual agreement of all with all proposes nothing other than a utopia, at the limit of any city. It is only with the second axiom, the principle of dissimilarity, that at least 2 possible states for the members of a city can be distinguished. We are no longer in Eden. The tests that attribute different states of affairs can begin. Therefore only a model of humanity in different states gives access to a political life. This is why it is necessary to add a supplementary axiom that defines the model of a well-ordered humanity. It is in terms of this polar status set over against the utopia of an undifferentiated Eden that we can talk about a common good, albeit in each case from the angle of some city or world. Having made this reservation, we can return to the question of compromise, or rather compromises, between each city and the other 5 cities. All that ever exists are the figures of compromise. Thus it seems an improper use of the term when one of the last chapters is titled Compromise for the Common Good. How can there be a super-compromise at the scale of the undivided political body, once compromise is only the suspension of some difference of opinion by which violence is avoided? That this is what is meant is clear. The principle intended by a compromise remains fragile so long as it cannot be referred back to a form of common good constitutive of a city. Putting in place a compromise does not allow ordering people in terms of some universal scale. In reading the part of this book devoted to compromise, one gets the impression that compromises are always weaker than the internal bonds of the different cities. The result is that if some higher common good is affected by the compromise, as a general figure of interaction, it is just as indeterminate as the bond set up by the compromise is fragile. Outside the utopia of Eden there is only the possibility of dealing with disagreements in terms of compromises always threatened by turning into a compromising of principles, on a slippery slope that recalls the perverse effect denounced by Walzer under the heading of conversion. I therefore want to ask whether with Boltanski and Thévenot as with Walzer, one has not underestimated the paradox of the political, resulting from the fact that the civic city is not a city like all the others, in any case not in the sense that the market, the family, or the inspired city are. I see a reinforcement of my perplexity in the very choice these authors make of Rousseau's social contract as a model of the civic city. If the social contract does work as a model, it is difficult to take it for the model of one city among others. It can only be the model of an inclusive city. To the extent that it is true that the general will tolerate no coalition within or outside itself, Rousseau would have called these other cities building bricks. Do these critical remarks undercut the analyses of Walzer and of Boltanski and Thévenot? I am more inclined to give credit to these two works for having helped us become aware of a previously unrecognized situation, or in any case one not thinkable in terms of our French Republican and Jacobin tradition, that is, that the state, as the source of right, finds itself today placed in the uncomfortable situation of an entity called upon to behave at the same time as the whole and as the part, as the container and the contained, as an inclusive agency and an included region. It is in this sense that our author's reticences, admitted or not, have become our own awkward position. This latter points to hard times for the question of rights. It will be no easier in the coming decades to reconcile indivisible popular sovereignty with the blossoming of a multitude of centers of rights than to reconcile this same indivisible sovereignty with new post-national, if not superstate, institutions, which themselves will give risk to rights. Just as we shall have to deal with a complex situation, stemming from the intertwining of several agencies of juridicity at the level of the state and the superstate, so too we shall more and more have to deal with a symmetrical situation issuing from the intertwining of several sources of juridicity at the infrastate level. This situation is a result of the figure that clothes the political paradox. Aesthetic judgment and political judgment according to Hannah Arendt. The goal of this essay is to examine Hannah Arendt's thesis, presented in the third unfortunately unfinished and posthumously published volume of her trilogy Thinking, Willing, Judging, the thesis that it would be possible to extract from the Kantian corpus, under the heading of the philosophy of history, a theory of political judgment that would satisfy the criteria applied to aesthetic judgment in the third critique, the critique of judgment. Aesthetic judgment, Kant. Before taking up Arendt's hypotheses, it will be useful to recall briefly the analyses Kant devotes to reflective judgment, of which aesthetic judgment is one of two expressions, putting the accent on their capacity to be extrapolated beyond the field covered by the third critique. If I do not begin straight away with his analysis of aesthetic judgment and linger over the encompassing concept of reflective judgment, it is so that I may leave a place for an alternative interpretation of Kant's political philosophy, one that will remain under the aegis of reflective judgment but not exclusively in terms of its aesthetic use. I shall begin therefore from the junction of the aesthetic and the teleological judgment, under the encompassing concept of reflective judgment. Let me say first of all that this conjunction demands a profound reworking of the very conception of judgment. The whole philosophical tradition up to Kant rested on the logical definition of judgment as a predicative act. The fundamental reversal Kant brought about consists in substituting for the idea of attribution that of subsumption, that is, an act by which a case is placed under a rule. The great innovation of the third critique in relation to the first critique is that it allows for all split within the idea of subsumption. In the first critique, subsumption proceeds so to speak from above to below, from the rule toward the fact of experience. This is the determinative judgment, so called because, in the application of a rule to a case, this judgment confers on experience the truth value of objectivity. The critique of judgment presents the hypothesis of an inverse functioning of subsumption. For a given case, one seeks the appropriate rule under which to place the singular experience. This judgment is merely reflective because the transcendental subject does not determine any universally valid objectivity, but instead only takes into account the procedures the mind follows in the operation of subsumption, proceeding in a way from below to above. 2. It is this amplitude of the notion of reflective judgment that we must keep in mind in the following discussion. Nonetheless, we cannot pass over in silence the priority Kant himself gives to aesthetic judgment in relation to teleological judgment. This priority results from the fact that the natural order thought in terms of the idea of finality itself has an aesthetic dimension in virtue of its very relation to the subject and not to the object. Order affects us in that it pleases us. With this, aesthetic judgment is called for by teleological judgment as the first component of reflective judgment, hence as regards pure reflection. Already in section 7 of the introduction, Kant can write that the object is said to be beautiful and that the power of judging on the basis of such pleasure is called taste. This cannot be said of mechanical order. It is not pleasing, for it does not respond to any expectation capable of being disappointed or fulfilled. It seems legitimate therefore to place the judgment of taste at the head of an investigation that seems first destined to find its full blossoming in a reflection on the natural finality presented by living organisms. The fragile unity of the two parts of the third critique rests finally on this possibility of shifting the accent, either to the pleasure of order or to its teleological structure. The transcendental aesthetic, left to itself, would face the threat of falling back into psychologism, transcendental teleology into naturalism. What assures a certain primacy to the judgment of taste in relation to the teleological judgment is the more immediately recognizable kinship between the beautiful and our expectation of a pure pleasure. Having said this, two features of the judgment oftest draw our attention: first, that taste should be and judgment; next, that it is its communicability alone that assures its universality. These two features constitute the two major axes of the analytic of the beautiful. In the first place, it is surprising that a more intimate sense than seeing or hearing, namely, taste, should be the support of a judgment. Following Gratian, Kant begins by emphasizing its immediately discriminating character, then its attachment to the particular, and finally its capacity for reflection. About what does taste reflect? About the free play among the representative faculties, essentially of the imagination and the understanding. The aesthetic pleasure that results from this reflection on free play is pure pleasure. It is pure pleasure in that, first of all, the judgment of taste does not make us know anything about the object, either in itself or as a cognitive phenomenon. What is more, this pure pleasure equally escapes moral censure precisely inasmuch as its attachment to the free play of imagination and understanding assures its disinterested character. The reflective aspect of this judgment has to do wholly with its referring not to a property of the beautiful thing, but to the state of free play of the representative faculties. In order to underscore the oddness of this qualitative moment, Kant risks two paradoxes that have fascinated his interpreters. The first is the paradox of some thing that pleases without a concept, that is, without any objectifying intention and without any claim to truth. This paradox is explained by the opposition between an objectifying, hence conceptual intention, and a reflective intention applied solely to the free play of imagination and understanding. This first paradox lends itself to the kind of transposition outside the aesthetic field attempted by Hannah Arendt. Let us therefore retain this idea of a free play whose two poles are the understanding and the imagination. The second paradox by means of which Kant underscores the strangeness of the pleasure included in the judgment of taste is the idea of a finality with no end indicated in the title of the third moment of the analytic of the beautiful. Here finality means an internal composition such that the parts are mutually adjusted to one another and to the whole. It is the finality that one finds elsewhere in the organization of living beings dealt with in the second part of the critique of judgment, but it is also a finality without an end in the sense that it is not sought or projected, as is the case in the relation between means and end in the techniques constitutive of human praxis. A beautiful flower presents this harmonious composition without referring back to some intentional activity. Next, it is unexpected that the judgment of taste claims universality. Hasn't this been endlessly discussed? The solution: taste is capable of a quite original form of universality, namely, communicability. Taste is a shared sense. And what is shared is precisely the reflection on the free play of the representative faculties. Taste therefore is universalizable in another way than are objective representations or the practical maxims of the free will. This equation between universality and communicability is without precedent in the first two critiques. We need to acknowledge the paradox of such communicability. It is a true paradox in the sense that nothing seems more incommunicable than a pure pleasure. Yet, to the extent that it is due to the contemplation of an inner finality, that is, to the mutual furthingness instituted by the free play of the faculties, this pleasure is in principle capable of being shared, ideally, by everyone. To reckon something beautiful is to admit that this thing must also involve a claim to being valid for everyone. To detach universality from objectivity, then reattach it to what pleases without concepts. And, what is more, is about something that presents the form of finality without the requirement of being treated like the means to some projected and sought for end, constitutes an extremely audacious advance in the question of universality. As soon as communicability does not result from some antecedent universality, it is this paradox of communicability, as instituting universality, we are tempted to seek in other domains than aesthetics. In the analytic of the beautiful, Kant only explores the more easily graspable implications. For example, the exemplarity of the beautiful, inasmuch as it calls for something following that would not be an imitation did he have in mind some goal beyond the norm, and it is in this way, by referring to one reason among others, that an argument invoking the intention of the legislator has to be weighed. In any case, were it to be known, even such an intention itself is not univocal. In this respect, all the genetic arguments, or arguments about pedigree, as Dworkin says, have to be placed under the same rubric as the historical or comparative arguments. In the end, recourse to theory and to so-called systematic arguments does not get us away from hermeneutics, but rather in a strange way leads back toward it owing to its multiple aspects of plurivocity. In the final analysis, a particular outcome must be assigned to the preceding argument. 18. In one sense, it does not have to do with external justification, inasmuch as a precedent, once recognized as a similar case, brings into play no other criterion than its capacity for universalization. However, it is the recognition of similitude that poses a problem. To say that some solution is a precedent is already to make some selection in the thesaurus of legal rulings. And in terms of what aspect are two cases similar? We are back to the respective weighing of resemblances and differences. And if agreement is reached concerning these, the question remains, which resemblances and which differences are relevant to the case under consideration. One can, of course, adopt as a rule expecting more from the argumentation of the one who challenges an already established precedent and pleads for an exception. In this regard, Perlman referred to a kind of principle of inertia that applies to the appeal to precedent. In light of the inertia of established judgments, there must be good reasons for deviating from the acquired way of interpreting things. A precedent assures the stability, security, and confidence of a decision. Here, though, the formalists observe that this overly sociological justification of recourse to precedent does not solve the problem of the argumentative structure of the appeal to precedent. They are correct. But it is precisely this argumentative structure that sets the interpretation in motion. The precedent appeals back to similarity, which is neither given nor invented, but constructed. In Dworkin's vocabulary, it is a case of constructive interpretation. Whether one argues for or against assumes that one tries out in imagination the hypothesis of resemblance or difference. Finally, we must no doubt make a place, as Atienza recommends, for insoluble cases given the present state of the law. Dworkin undoubtedly goes too far in affirming that there is always a right answer to the question posed by hard cases, in order to block the invasive recourse to discretionary power in a positivist conception of law. The tragic cases Atienza willingly discusses in effect call on a sense of justice or equity that is difficult to formalize, or, one might say, on a sense of justness more than justice. At the conclusion of this discussion, perhaps my reader will grant that the interweaving of argumentation and interpretation on the judicial plane is indeed symmetrical to that between explanation and understanding on the plane of the sciences of discourse and of the text. Over against an approach to this well-known polarity in terms of a pure dichotomy, I have elsewhere concluded my plea for their dialectical treatment with an aphoristic formula, to explain more in order to understand better. In concluding my discussion of the debate over interpretation and argumentation, I want to propose a similar formula that will restore a complex unity to the epistemology of the judicial debate. The point where interpretation and argumentation overlap is the one where Dworkin's regressive and ascending way and Alexei and Atenz's progressive and descending way intersect. The former finds its starting point in the difficult question posed by hard cases and from there rises toward the ethico-political horizon of the judicial enterprise considered in terms of its historical unfolding. The latter proceeds from a general theory of argumentation valid for every form of normative practical discussion and encounters juridical argument as a subordinate province. The first way reaches the common crossroads at the moment when the theory of interpretation encounters the question posed by the narrative model of criteria of coherence applying to judgment in juridical matters. The second reaches it when, in order to account for the specificity of juridical argumentation, procedures of interpretation again find their relevance as the organon of the juridical syllogism thanks to which a case is placed under a rule. I even went so far as to risk a suggestion of another analogy besides the dialectic between explanation and understanding, namely, that of the reflective judgment in the sense of Kant's critique of judgment, interpretation becoming the way the productive imagination follows once the problem is no longer to apply a known rule to a presumably correctly described case, as with determinative judgment, but to find a rule under which it is appropriate to place a fact that itself must be interpreted. Then it becomes a question of showing that we do not really change problematics when we pass from the analogy between the pair to interpret/to argue and the pair to understand/to explain to the analogy with reflective judgment. This will be the object of another discussion whose echo can be found in another essay in this collection. The act of judging. It is at the endpoint of the arguments that make up a trial that I want to place myself in order to take up the subject proposed here. Indeed, it is at the end of deliberation that the act of judgment takes place. It is a kind of phenomenology of this act that I want to propose for discussion. Ricoeur distinguish a short-term end, in virtue of which judging signifies deciding, with an eye to ending uncertainty. To this I shall oppose a long-term end, undoubtedly more concealed, namely, the contribution of a judgment to public peace. It is the path from this short-term end to the long-term end that I want to discuss. Let us begin by saying that judging is deciding. This initial finality leaves the act of judging, in the judicial sense of the word, within the range of non-technical, non-judicial meanings of the act of judging, whose components and criteria I want briefly to recall. In the usual sense of the word, the verb to judge covers a range of major senses that I propose to arrange in what I shall call an order of increasing density. First, in a weak sense, to judge is to opine. However, an opinion is expressed about something. In a slightly stronger sense, to judge is to value, to assess. In this way, a hierarchical element is introduced, expressing a preference, an evaluation, an approbation. A third degree of force expresses the encounter between the subjective and the objective sides of judgment. Objective side, someone takes a proposition as true, good, just, legal. Subjective side, he subscribes to it. Finally, at a deeper level than the one assumed by Descartes in his fourth meditation, judgment proceeds from the conjunction between understanding and will. The understanding that considers the true and false, the will that decides. In this way we have reached the strong sense of the word judge, not just to opine, value, take as true, but in the final analysis, to take a stand. It is from this ordinary sense of the word that we can depart to rejoin the properly judicial sense of the act of judging. With the judicial sense, judgment in effect intervenes in social practice, at the level of that exchange of discourse Georgian Habermas links to communicative activity, thanks to the central phenomenon of this social practice constituted by the trial in a law court. It is within the framework of the trial that the act of judging recapitulates all the ordinary senses: opine, assess, take as true or false, and finally, take a stand. The question then arises under what conditions the act of judging in its judicial form can be said to be authorized or competent. In my essay Le Just Entre le Legal et le Bon, 1 considered 4 such conditions: I. The existence of written laws, 2. The presence of an institutional framework, courts, appeal courts, and so on, 3. The intervention of qualified, competent, independent persons, who we say are charged with judging, 4. Finally, a course of action constituted by the trial process, referred to above, where the pronouncement of judgment constitutes the end point. Of course, beyond this point well named in French, arrêt, it is always possible to deliberate, in the sense that every judgment calls for a but beyond itself. However, it is a characteristic of judgment on the judicial plane to interrupt the back and forth play of arguments by giving them an end point, even if this latter is provisory, at least so long as the ways of appeal remain open. But there will ultimately be a place or moment where a final ruling is sanctioned by public force. Before showing why we cannot limit ourselves to this definition of the act of judging, entirely delimited by the conditions of the trial process, it is important to emphasize the social necessity attached to that finality we have called short-term, consisting in the interruption of uncertainty. Within the strict limits of the trial process, the act of judging appears as the terminal phase of a drama with several actors: the parties or their representatives, the public attorney, the judge, the jury, and so on. What is more, this terminal act appears as the closure of an unpredictable process. In this regard, there is something here like a game of chess. The rules of the game are known, but in each instance one does not know how the game will reach its end. The trial is to the law what a game of chess is to the rules of chess. In both cases, one has to get to the end to know the result. This is how a ruling puts an end to a virtually endless deliberation. And despite the limitations I shall speak of in a moment, the act of judging, by suspending the hazards of the trial, expresses the force of law. What is more, it states the law in terms of a singular situation. It is through the twofold relation it has with the law that this act of judging expresses the force of law. On the one side, in effect, it seems simple to apply the law to a case. We have what Kant calls a determinative judgment. But there is also the question of an interpretation of the law, insofar as no case is simply the exemplification of a rule. To use Kantian language again, we can say that act of judging stems from a reflective judgment, itself consisting in seeking a rule for a new case. In this second sense, the ruling is not limited to ending a trial. It opens the way to a whole course of jurisprudence insofar as it creates a precedent. The suspending aspect of the act of judging at the end of a deliberative course therefore does not exhaust the meaning of this act. Before expanding on my thesis, I want also to say that, considered in terms of the strict limits of the trial process, the exercise of the act of judging easily finds a place in the general functioning of society, considered by Rawls as a vast system for distributing shares. Indeed, it is under the aegis of the idea of distributive justice that the act of judging can be represented. In effect, a given society develops a scheme for passing out shares, which are not all measured in monetary terms assignable to the commercial order. A given society distributes goods of all kinds, those that can be exchanged and those that cannot. Taken in a broad sense, the act of judging consists in separating spheres of activity, in delimiting the claims of the one from those of the other, and finally in correcting unjust distributions, when the activity of one party encroaches on the field of exercise of other parties. In this respect, the act of judging certainly consists in separating. The German term Urteil expresses this well. It is indeed a matter of deciding the part of one and that of another. The act of judging is therefore one of departage 3 one that se pair, that separates. In saying this, I am saying nothing out of the ordinary, inasmuch as the ancient Roman definition suum quicque tribuere, to attribute to each his own, was implicitly oriented toward the analysis proposed here. What is more, the whole of Kant's philosophy of right rests on this distinction between mine and yours, on the act that draws a line between the one and the other. These latter considerations have to do with the act of deciding, in the sense of separating, of opening the way to the decisive expansion announced at the beginning of this lecture. Why, in fact, can we not stop with what I have called the short-term finality of the act of judging, that is, with putting an end to uncertainty? Because the trial process itself is only the codified form of a broader phenomenon, namely, that of conflict. It is a question therefore of replacing the trial process, with its precise procedures, against the background of the broader social phenomenon inherent in the functioning of civil society and situated at the origin of public discussion. This is where we have to go. Behind the trial process lies conflict, differences of opinion, quarrels, litigation, and behind conflict lies violence. The place of justice is marked out in a provisionary manner in this way, as being part of the set of alternatives that a society opposes to violence and that at the same time defines a state of right. In Lectures 1 paid homage to Eric Weil, who introduced his great work, Logique de la Philosophie, with a long meditation on the relation between discourse and violence. In a way, all the operations I have referred to, from deliberation to rendering a decision to passing judgment, manifest the choice of discourse over violence. We get a sense of the importance of this choice against violence and for discourse only if we remind ourselves of the scope of the phenomenon of violence. It would be wrong to reduce violence to aggression, even when broadened beyond physical aggression, blows, wounds, death, a restriction on freedom, detention, and so on. We need also to take into account the most tenacious form of violence, namely, vengeance, or, in other words, an individual's claim to procure justice by himself. At bottom, justice is opposed not just to violence per se, or even to concealed violence or all the subtle forms just alluded to, but to that simulation of justice constituted by vengeance, the act of procuring justice by oneself. In this sense, the fundamental act by means of which we can speak of justice is founded on a society. It is the act by which society raises individuals to the level of right and law and the power to obtain justice for themselves, the act by which public power confiscates for itself the power to pronounce and to apply the law. What is more, it is in virtue of this confiscation that the most civilized operations of justice, in particular in the penal sphere, still bear the visible imprint of this original violence that is vengeance. In many respects, punishment, especially if it preserves some aspect of the old idea of expiation, remains an attenuated, filtered, civilized form of vengeance. This persistence of violence as vengeance means that we only accede to the sense of justice through the detour of the protest against injustice. The cry unfair often expresses an insightful intuition concerning the true nature of society, and the place violence still holds in it, as well as regards all rational or reasonable discourse about justice. Having come to this point, we arrive at the question of the ultimate finality of the act of judging. Returning to our analysis of the act of judging, starting from the far-reaching operation that consisted in the state taking from individuals the direct exercise of justice, and in the first place of vengeance as the means of justice, it turns out that the horizon of the act of judging is finally something more than security, it is social peace. How does this ultimate finality throw any light on our initial definition of the act of judging in terms of its short-term finality, that is, its putting an end to uncertainty through the act of rendering a decision? To decide, we said, is to separate, to draw a line between yours and mine. The finality of social peace makes apparent something more profound that has to do with mutual recognition. Let us not say reconciliation, even less ought we to speak of love and pardon, which are not juridical categories. Let us speak instead of recognition. But in what sense? I think that the act of judging reaches its goal when someone who has, as we say, won his case still feels able to say, my adversary, the one who lost, remains like me a subject of right, his cause should have been heard, he made plausible arguments and these were heard. However, such recognition will not be complete unless the same thing can also be said by the loser, the one who did wrong, who has been condemned. He should be able to declare that the sentence that condemns him was not an act of violence but rather one of recognition. To what vision of society does this reflection lead us? Somewhere beyond, I think, the conception of society as distributing shares, which do always need to be apportioned in order to determine which ones belong to this or that person. This would be the vision of society as a model of social cooperation. After all, this expression appears in the opening uns of John Rawls's Theory of Justice, a work in which nevertheless it is the analysis of society as a system of distribution that carries the day. The question is worth asking, what is it that makes society something more than a system of distribution? Or better, what is it that makes distribution a means of cooperation? Here is where a more substantial element than pure procedural justice has to be taken into account, namely, something like a common good, consisting in shared values. We are then dealing with a communitarian dimension underlying the purely procedural dimension of the societal structure. Perhaps we may even find in the metaphor of sharing the two aspects I am here trying to coordinate in terms of each other. In sharing there are shares, that is, those things that separate us. My share is not yours. But sharing is also what makes us share, that is, in the strong sense of the term, share in. I conclude then that the act of judging has as its horizon a fragile equilibrium of these two elements of sharing, that which separates my share or part from yours and that which, on the other hand, means that each of us shares in, takes part in society. It is the just distance between partners who confront one another, too closely in cases of conflict and too distant in those of ignorance, hate, and scorn, that sums up rather well, I believe, the two aspects of the act of judging. On the one hand, to decide, to put an end to uncertainty, to separate the parties; on the other, to make each party recognize the share the other has in the same society, thanks to which the winner and the loser of any trial can be said to have their fair share in that model of cooperation that is society. Sanction, rehabilitation, pardon. The organizers of the colloquy Justice or Vengeance, 1. have given me the task of introducing the section placed under the aegis of the three words sanction, rehabilitation, pardon. The contribution of a philosopher seems to me to be, here as in analogous situations, that of offering an analysis, one intended to offer some conceptual clarification, to help us recognize what is at stake, and finally to distinguish its ends. As a first approximation, then, it is a trajectory that is proposed for our examination, a trajectory that begins with sanction, that continues, in certain circumstances and within certain precise limits which we have yet to spell out, in a project of restoration, and finally, in still more specific circumstances, that ends in making someone the beneficiary of a pardon that is not owed to him. His punishment is ended, he is re-established in terms of both public esteem and self-esteem. All this is a first approximation. One doubt may immediately come to mind: is it a question of a continuous trajectory? Are the instances authorized for sanction, rehabilitation, and pardon all the same? To this can be added a connected doubt: is it a question of one and the same, continually passive subject, concerning whom we say that he is sanctioned, that he is rehabilitated, that he is pardoned? In order to respond to these doubts we have to move back to the beginning. What presents itself as the first term of the discontinuous and unpredictable triad of sanction, rehabilitation, and pardon is in terms of the reality of the judicial experience the last theme of a better interconnected sequence, along which what is at stake in our interrogation gets decided and takes on substance, namely, the difference between vengeance and justice. At the moment of pronouncing the sentence, something essential has already been decided, the verdict. The subject who has formerly been held to be innocent has been declared guilty, hence punishable, hence subject to the punishment about to be announced. Because our proposed trajectory gets underway too late, it has left behind it the break that preoccupies us here, that between justice and vengeance. The reason is that this break takes place before the sentence in the trial process. And the sentence itself only makes sense as a penalty because it closes and ends the trial. Therefore it is in terms of the structure of the trial process, as it ought to unfold within a state of right, that we have to seek the principle of the break between vengeance and justice. Sometimes we say that to avenge oneself is to obtain justice for oneself. But no, the word justice should not figure in any definition of vengeance, making allowance for the archaic and sacred sense of justice which is through and through vindictive and vengeful, which we do have to make sense of in the final analysis. For the moment, we have to do only with elementary, emotional, savage vengeance, the kind that wants to inscribe the punishment in the wake of the crime. The question thus arises: by what means, with what resources, in the name of what principle the trial process breaks with this kind of vengeance? Before dividing this process into its structural elements, we can characterize it overall in the following terms. It consists in establishing a just distance between the hideous crime that unleashes private and public anger, and the punishment inflicted by the judicial institution. Whereas vengeance short-circuits the two forms of suffering, that undergone by the victim and that inflicted by the avenger, the trial process gets interposed between these two, instituting the just distance we have just spoken of. So our question is to recapitulate the means by which the exercise of penal law establishes the gap between violence and the word of jus. Tis. 4 elements appear to make up the structural conditions of every judicial hearing. First of all is that a third party, not party to the hearing and qualified to open a space of discussion, is presupposed. Under this general heading of a third party we can set 3 distinct cases. First, the institution of a state distinct from civil society and, in this regard, the guardian of legitimate violence. Second, our conception of the judicial institution as distinct from other powers of the state, to which we must not fail to add as a third aspect making up this third party the particular mode of recruiting judicial personnel. Here the third party takes on the human figure of the judge. It is important to set this out from the beginning, inasmuch as judges are human beings like us, but raised above us in order to decide conflicts, at the end of qualifying tests meant to help ensure the acceptability of the verdict, something we shall discuss in greater detail below. Our third party does not find himself set in the required nonpartisan position except when backed by a juridical system consisting essentially of written laws, their inscription and conservation representing a considerable cultural acquisition thanks to which state power and judicial power are conjointly established. It is up to the laws on the one hand to define crimes, and on the other to establish a proportion between crime and punishment. The first operation contributes to bringing about a distance from violence by making possible the use of the qualification crime as applied to infractions defined and named in the most unequivocal way possible. Furthermore, the establishment of a double scale of crimes and punishments, on the basis of a rule of proportionality, when added to the qualification of what counts as a crime, allows any incriminated act to be situated with the greatest possible precision, not just on the chart but also on the scale of crimes. Next comes the essential element that gives the whole structure its title, namely, the hearing. Its function is to carry the pending case from a state of uncertainty to one of certitude. To do this, it is important that the hearing bring into play a plurality of protagonists who together judge, public prosecutor, attorneys for the parties involved contribute to setting up what I am calling a just distance, this time between the defendant and the accuser. This consideration of a plurality of protagonists in the hearing adds an important correction to the simple idea of a judging third party. The gap set up by this basic unit of the hearing transforms the flesh and blood victim, as well as the presumed guilty party, into parties in the trial process, into accuser and defendant. But we have not yet spoken of what is most essential. It is important that the hearing be oral and confrontational, and established as such by a known procedure imposed on every protagonist in the hearing. In this way the hearing presents itself as a war of words, argument against argument, the arms being the same and equal on both sides. Finally, we must not omit underlining that the passive subject of our first approximation, someone is judged, is promoted by the hearing into an actor in the trial process. Below, we shall consider the importance of this mutation, when we run through the proposed sequence from sentence to rehabilitation to pardon. One last word about the fourth structural component of the trial process, the verdict. With it, guilt is legally established. With it, the accused changes juridical status from presumed innocent to declared guilty. This mutation is a result of the performative virtue of the speech act that states the law in some determined circumstance. I want to insist, at the end of this first section, on this expression, to state the law. I will consider below the therapeutic virtue to be found along the path of rehabilitation. Even before that, however, the speech act that states the law already has numerous effects. It brings an end to uncertainty, it assigns the parties in the trial places that determine the just distance between vengeance and justice. Finally, and perhaps above all, it recognizes as actors those persons who are accused of the offense and who stand to suffer the penalty. In this very effect lies the most significant reply given by justice to vengeance. It sums up the suspending of vengeance. 2. It is now possible to return to the sequence we propose to examine: sanction, rehabilitation, pardon. Sanction. We have not yet spoken of what is essential concerning the sanction as qualifying the final act of the trial process as the sentencing. The punishment has certainly taken on its penal aspect, at the end of the ceremony, in language whereby the rupture with vengeance is consummated and whereby violence is poured into language. Yes, the punishment has been set at a just distance from the crime. But we have not said to whom the sanction is due, who are its addressees. It is the answer to this question that gives meaning to the sentence as a penal sanction. If we review again the structural components of the trial process, we have to say that the sanction is due in the first place to the law, not certainly due to the law rather than to the victim, but owed to the victim because it is due to the law. Kant and Hegel join hands on this point with the idea that the sanction restores the law. For the one as for the other, the law expresses the body of moral conventions that assures the minimal consensus of the political body, a consensus summed up in the idea of order. With regard to this order, every infraction is an attack against the law, something that upsets order. We can give a religious version of this idea, where one ties the law to an immutable, divinely guaranteed order. However, a profane version has bit by bit been substituted for the idea of an offense against the gods and taken the form of a secularized idea of a disturbed social order, of a threatened public peace. In both versions of such transgression, the punishment has as its first function to mend a public disorder, in short, to re-establish order. Hegel gives this process the dialectical form of a negation of negation. To the disorder that negates order responds the negation of disorder that re-establishes order. Having said this, we cannot avoid the question in what sense the sanction can be said to be owed to the victim. The answer seems self-evident. Is it not to a flesh and blood person more than to some abstract/law that reparation is due? Of course. Nevertheless, it remains necessary to say how this reparation is distinguished once again from vengeance. Must we not here pass through a point of doubt, suggested by the disillusioned comment of the sage meditating on the doubtful validity of all forms of punishment? Do not these, in the cosmic sum of rights and wrongs, add more suffering to suffering? Is punishing not, essentially, and in one way or another, a way of making someone suffer? And what are we to say about punishments that are in no way reparations in the sense of restoring a prior state of affairs, as is clearly the case with murder and other serious offenses? Perhaps punishment re-establishes order, but it cannot give back a life. These disillusioned remarks invite us to put the principal accent on the moral signification of the sanction. We need to go back to what was said above about the speech act that states the law. As was suggested in passing, the victim is publicly recognized as having been offended against and humiliated, that is, excluded from the regime of reciprocity owing to the fact that a crime sets up an unjust distance. This public recognition does not count for nothing. Society declares the litigant a victim in declaring the accused guilty. Yet recognition can also follow a more intimate route, one that touches self-esteem. Here we can say that something is restored, under names as diverse as honor, good reputation, self-respect, and, I like to emphasize the term, self-esteem, that is, the dignity attached to the moral status of the human person. Perhaps we can go a step further and suggest that this intimate recognition, touching on self-esteem, is capable of contributing to a work of mourning through which the wounded soul is reconciled with itself, in internalizing the figure of the lost loved object. This would be a somewhat unexpected application of the famous words of the Apostle, "The truth will set you free." In the great trials to which the disasters of our century have given rise, this work of mourning is offered not just to the victims, if they still exist, but to their descendants, kin, and allies, whose pain merits being honored. In this work of mourning, prolonging the public recognition of the offense, it is possible to recognize the moral and not just the aesthetic version of the catharsis offered by the tragic spectacle, according to Aristotle. The question still has to be considered whether through the sanction something is not owed to public opinion. Our answer must be affirmative. Public opinion is first of all the vehicle, next the amplifier, and finally the broadcaster of the desire for vengeance. We cannot overemphasize the effect of publicity, in the sense of making public, given among others by the media to the ceremony of the trial process and the promulgation of the penalty. This publicity should consist in an education about fairness, by disciplining our impure vindictive desires. And the first threshold in this education is constituted by the indignation, whose name we had not yet pronounced, which, poorly distinguished from the thirst for vengeance, already begins to distance itself, once it is addressed to the dimension of injustice of the wrong that has been done. In this sense, indignation is already measured by the meaning of the law and affected by the public disturbance resulting from the infraction. Indignation, furthermore, has the virtue of binding together the emotion caused by the spectacle of the injured law and that solicited by the spectacle of the humiliated person. It is in all these senses that indignation constitutes the basic feeling starting from which public education about fairness has the chance of succeeding. In short, something is owed by the sanction to public opinion as well, which will be crowned by a certain catharsis of vengeance. The last question remains, how and to what point is the sanction due to the guilty one, the condemned person? Our answer to this question conditions the whole of our proposed sequence: sanction, rehabilitation, pardon. At the beginning of our itinerary, the penal subject was implicitly taken to be passive. To be punished, to be rehabilitated, to be pardoned are all states an accused person is supposed to traverse. Yet, we said, the process had already made this person an actor, a protagonist in the hearing. How can he further become the protagonist, the actor of the sanction? Must we not say, at least in the ideal sense, that the sanction will have reached its goal, fulfilled its purpose, only if the penalty is, if not accepted, at least understood by the one who undergoes it? This limit idea, perhaps we should say, regulative idea, was implied by the idea of recognition, recognition of the litigant as victim, recognition of the accused as guilty. And if recognition pursues its trajectory into the intimacy of the person offended against in the form of a restoration of self-esteem, is not self-recognition as guilty a kind of recognition that is symmetrically expected as corresponding to this recognition on the part of the victim? I will say that we have here the regulative idea of condemnation. If sanction must have a future, under the forms we will soon speak of as rehabilitation and pardon, must it not be that, from the rendering of the sanction, the accused knows himself to be recognized at least as a reasonable, responsible being, that is, as the author of his acts? Hegel, whom I have already cited, pushes the paradox so far as to maintain that the death penalty, to which only a human being can be subjected, was a way of honoring the guilty person as a rational being. Of course, we have better reasons to refuse the death penalty, if only the idea we have of a state that, in limiting its own impulse to vengeance, prohibits itself from itself acting like a criminal in the figure of the executioner. But at least we may retain from Hegel's argument the claim that only a reasonable being can be punished. So long as the sanction has not been recognized as reasonable by the condemned person, it has not reached this ladder as a reasonable being. It is this failure of the sanction to complete its course within the framework of the trial process that opens the sequence to which we are now going to turn. Rehabilitation. Indeed, why should we want to give a continuation to the sanction? Could we not stop there if the law, the victim, and public opinion are satisfied? The failure of the sanction to be recognized by the condemned leads us to the neighborhood of the notion of a just distance, introduced at the beginning of this meditation. Is the sanction not received, in a general way, by the condemned as an excess of distance? An excess figured, physically and geographically, by the condition of the prisoner whose incarceration marks exclusion from the city? And is not this excess symbolically signified by accessory penalties, loss of public and private esteem, loss of different legal and civic statuses? Whence the idea of a continuation given to the sanction as meant to reduce, degree by degree, this excess of distance and to re-establish a just distance. In speaking of rehabilitation, the organizers of the program for this colloquy perhaps were not thinking especially of the narrowly juridical sense of rehabilitation. Even if they were right to place the accent on the sense ordinarily attached to this term, namely, the set of measures accompanying the execution of a sentence, meant to restore the condemned person to full citizenship again at the end of his sentence, it will be worthwhile to linger for a moment over the properly juridical forms of rehabilitation, particularly insofar as the idea that presides over the operations in question is that of restoring a person to the rightful place, capacity, and legal status he has lost. There are two principal situations to consider here. First, there is the automatic and fully legal rehabilitation to which any condemned person accedes after having served his sentence and after the passing of a period proportional to the level of the infraction and the level of the case that led to the imposed sanction. The new French legal code says about rehabilitation to one's full rights that it wipes away all incapacities and loss of rights. We need to underscore the verb phrase to wipe away, which is key to the continuation of our sequence that ends in pardon. This wiping away is marked by an aspect of an exception, in the sense of the solemn interruption of the sanction when it has not been applied strictly in accordance with the law. One thinks here of those grand rehabilitations of the victims of purges, constitutive of crimes of the state that happened under totalitarian regimes, where less totalitarian or more democratic regimes try to repair what has happened and to wipe out its traces to the benefit of the re-established honor of the victims or their heirs. We can also think here of the overturning of presumed judicial errors. Given the rarity of these situations, it is a question of quite complex procedures, having to do with the code of penal procedure and outlining the status of the one demanding rehabilitation and of its beneficiary, as well as where and how such cases are to be heard. I shall not go into these procedural questions, which add nothing to the intended end of legal rehabilitation and which we have seen expressed in such phrases as wipe out the incapacities, re-establish the rights, that is, finally to restore a fundamental human capacity, that of the citizen as bearer of civic and legal rights. 3. Quite clearly, it is these ideas of wiping away, of re-establishment, of restoration we refer to when we try to introduce a project of rehabilitation into the execution of a sentence. It is a question of giving the condemned person the opportunity to become a full citizen once more at the end of the sentence and therefore to end the physical and symbolic exclusion that finds its fullest expression in imprisonment. I shall not consider here those projects of re-education aimed at the re-socialization of condemned prisoners. They stem from what we might call the pedagogy of sentencing. Instead, I shall limit myself to a few remarks that may contribute to the conceptual clarification of the term rehabilitation, in terms consistent with the general tone of my contribution here. I propose first of all that we reflect upon the proposal, made by Antoine Garapon among others, to introduce the concept of the continuity of public space, in order to inscribe the place of the space of the prison within, not outside the city. I want to retain just one particularly striking application of this concept which, to my knowledge at least, is still quite new. Are infractions committed in prison to be referred to the same tribunals as all other infractions committed within the space of jurisdiction of the state? Another component of re-education to sociability, we ought to place under a single heading all those aspects of the execution of the sentence that have nothing to do with security, whether it be a question of health, work, schooling, leisure, visitation rights, even the normal expression of sexuality, and so on. The directive idea that pulls together all these many measures coming from diverse interventions is indeed still that of wiping away an incapacity, or restoring some capacity. It is in this perspective that we should take up again the discussion of the length of a sentence. If we approach this not just from the point of view of security, that is, from the point of view of the legitimate protection of society, it is the lived experience of the prisoner during the time of the sentence that has to be taken into consideration. From the few psychological studies of prisoners I have been able to examine, it seems that the time of a sentence is experienced in terms of different modalities, depending upon whether one considers the time segment closest to the trial, where time is experienced in terms of the haunting memory of this ordeal, the middle time period, where coming to terms with the prison environment is the main concern of the prisoner, or the last period of the sentence, where thoughts of liberation tend to occupy the whole of one's mental space. One result is that how these successive figures of the experience of the time of a sentence go together differs completely depending on the length of the sentence. We can assume that beyond a certain time span the execution of a sentence is equivalent to an accelerated process of desocialization. A ferocious beast, not a free person, is progressively engendered by such exclusion, at the expense of any project of reinsertion into society. This disturbing perspective even resonates with the security aspects of the execution of a sentence. I hope you will allow me to say in this regard that the notion of a life sentence constitutes a flagrant negation of any idea of rehabilitation, and in this sense completely negates any project of re-establishment, even in the execution of the sentence, of a just distance between the detainee and the rest of society. Amnesty and mercy. We cannot pass directly from the idea of rehabilitation to that of pardon without saying a word about two dispositions that we can take as intermediary between them, amnesty and mercy. We can deal quickly with the latter term, inasmuch as it consists in something like a royal privilege, having the same effects as rehabilitation as concerns wiping out principal and secondary penalties. However, we need to spend more time with amnesty, inasmuch as the sort of rehabilitation proceeds not from the juridical realm, but from the political realm, in principle the legislature, even if the leadership comes from the executive branch. If I linger over the question of amnesty, it is because, despite appearances, it in no way prepares the way to a correct understanding of the idea of pardon. In many ways, it constitutes the antithesis of pardon. Amnesty, which French Republican governments have used a great deal ever since the amnesty of the Communards, in effect is a wiping away that goes well beyond the execution of sentences. To the prevention of any indictment, hence to the prevention of any pursuit of criminals, is added a prohibition even to refer to the facts themselves in terms of their criminal aspect. Therefore it is a question of a veritable institutional amnesia that invites us to act as though something never happened. For several authors have observed, with some uneasiness, what there is of magic, even of desperation, in the enterprise meant to wipe out all trace of dramatic events, as if one could ever wipe away the blood from Lady Macbeth's hands. What is at issue here? Certainly, national reconciliation. And in this regard, it is perfectly legitimate to seek to mend things by forgetting the tears in the social fabric. But we may worry about the price of this reaffirmation of the indivisible character of the sovereign political body. It is for a Jacobin conception of the state which identifies its presumed rationality with universality that there is a need periodically to wipe out the traces of misdeeds done by whomever, whose memory would constitute a living denial of the claim of the state to rationality. This is a heavy price to pay. All the detrimental effects of forgetting are contained in this incredible claim to wipe away the traces of public discord. It is in this sense that amnesty is the contrary of pardon, which, as I shall insist, requires memory. This is why it comes down to historians to counteract through discourse the pseudo-juridical attempt to wipe out the facts. Their task thus takes on a subversive turn, inasmuch as it leads to expressing the nemesis of the trace. Pardon. It is difficult to situate correctly the idea of pardon on the trajectory indicated by our three terms: sanction, rehabilitation, pardon. We can say two contradictory, but perhaps equally necessary, even complementary things concerning the link between pardon and all the juridical forms that encompass sanction, rehabilitation, mercy, and amnesty. On the one hand, pardon does not belong to the juridical order. It does not stem from the same plane of the law. We could speak of it as Pascal speaks of charity in his well-known passage about the three orders: the order of the body, the order of spirit, the order of charity. Indeed, pardon outruns the law as much through its logic as through its end. From one point of view, which we can call epistemological, it stems from an economy of the gift, in virtue of the logic of superabundance that articulates it and that has to be opposed to the logic of equivalence presiding over justice. In this regard, pardon is not just a super-juridical but a super-ethical value. But it nevertheless outruns the law through its end. To make sense of this, we must first say who carries it out. Absolutely speaking, this can only be the victim. In this regard, pardon is never owed. Not only cannot it not be expected, but such an expectation can be legitimately refused. To this extent, pardon must first have run into the unpardonable, that is, the infinite debt, the irreparable wrong. Having said this, although not owed, it is still not without an end. And this end has to do with memory. Its project is not to wipe away memory. It is not forgetting. On the contrary, its project, which is to overlook the debt, is incompatible with that of overlooking what is forgotten. 5. Pardon is a kind of healing of memory, the end of mourning. Delivered from the weight of debt, memory is freed for great projects. Pardon gives memory a future. Having said this, we are not prevented from asking whether pardon may not have a kind of secondary effect on the juridical order itself, insofar as, in escaping it, pardon looms over it. I will say two things in this regard. On the one hand, as the horizon of the sequence sanction, rehabilitation, pardon, pardon constitutes a permanent reminder that justice is the justice of human beings and that it must not set itself up as the final judgment. What is more, can we not take as the fallout of pardon on justice all the manifestations of compassion, of goodwill, at the very heart of the administration of justice, as though justice, touched by mercy, did not seek within its own sphere that extreme term that ever since Aristotle we have called fairness or equity. Finally, to conclude, I would like to suggest the following idea. Does it not come down to pardon to accompany justice in its effort to eradicate on the symbolic plane the sacred element of vengeance, to which I referred in passing? It is not only from savage vengeance that justice seeks to dissociate itself, but from sacred vengeance as well, in virtue of which book calls for blood, and which itself claims the mantle of justice. On the deepest symbolic plane, what is at stake is the separation between Dike, the justice of humans, and Themis, the ultimate and shadowy refuge of the equation of vengeance and justice. Does it not belong to pardon to exercise over this malicious sacred the catharsis that makes a benevolent sacred emerge from it? Greek tragedy, that of the Orestia in the first place, teaches us that the Erinyes and the Eumenides are one and the same. In a dazzling aside, Hegel notes in his Principles of the Philosophy of Right, the Eumenides sleep, but crime awakens them. 6. This essay stems from an initial refusal, my refusal to allow myself to be caught in an apparently restrictive dilemma where law, as immutable, universal, constraining, and objective, would be opposed term by term to conscience, held to be variable, circumstantial, spontaneous, and eminently subjective. This dilemma becomes frozen in a way when, beyond this, we place it under the malicious guard of such mutually defamatory categories as dogmatism and situationalism. The problem is not just to refute this apparent dilemma, but to construct a plausible model of correlation among the terms of a paralyzing alternative. In order to get us out of this apparent dilemma, I propose to distinguish several levels where law and conscience, in each case in a different way, can be paired up in the progressive constitution of the moral. At a first level, which we can call fundamental, I will set on the side of the pole of the law the most elementary discrimination between good and evil, and on the side of conscience the emergence of a personal identity constituted in relation to this basic discrimination. At this fundamental level, it does not make sense perhaps to speak of law in the strong sense of a moral obligation, nor of conscience in the sense of obedience to one's duty. In a sense closer to Aristotle than to Kant, I shall adopt, following my friend Charles Taylor in his Sources of the Selfie, the expression strong evaluations, meaning by this the most stable estimations of ordinary conscience, which, through their binary structure, each express in their own way what I have called the discrimination between good and evil. In this regard, ordinary moral experience has at its disposal an extraordinarily rich vocabulary that gives the pair good/bad a considerable number of variations. We need only think of such pairs of terms as honorable/shameful, worthy/unworthy, admirable/abominable, sublime/despicable, pleasing/distressing, noble/vile, suave/abject, without forgetting what Jean Nabert had to say about the pair venerable/unjustifiable. We have to start from this rich palette if we are to unfold the implications of the proposed expression, strong evaluations. The term evaluation expresses the fact that human life is not morally neutral, but, once it is examined, following the precept of Socrates, lends itself to a basic discrimination between what is approved as the better and what is disapproved as the worse. If the term law does not quite fit at this elementary level, at least in the strict sense I have spoken of, strong evaluations do present a series of characters that set us on the way to the normative sense attached to the idea of the law. Beyond the reflective labor of discrimination expressed by the variety of evaluative predicates enumerated above, we have to take into account what Taylor places under the heading of articulation, that is, the ordering of strong evaluations where the qualitative heterogeneity of their intended goods imposes a kind of dispersion through their intervention. To this work of coordination is added those attempts at hierarchization that allow us to speak, again with Taylor, of goods of a higher order, of hypergoods. It is to such attempts that we owe the diverse typologies of virtues and vices that occupy the place we all know in the moral treatises of ancient, medieval, and even early modern moralists of what in France we call the classical age. These classifications serve to mark out the median level of moral reflection, halfway from the strong evaluations considered in terms of their spontaneous dispersion and their aiming at the good life, that is, the wish for a fulfilled life, which constitutes in a way the receding horizon of such strong evaluations. HIIS then is what I would set at the beginning on the side of the pole of law. What will I place on the side of the pole of conscience? Here too I will follow the suggestion of Charles Taylor by pairing the idea of the self and that of the good. This correlation expresses the fact that the question who am I, presiding over every search for personal identity, finds a first outline of an answer in the modes of adhesion by which we respond to the solicitation of strong evaluations. In this respect, we can make the different variations of the discrimination of good and evil correspond to different ways of orienting oneself in what Taylor calls moral space, ways of taking one's stand there in the moment and of maintaining one's place over time. As a moral being, I am someone who assumes an orientation, takes a stand, and maintains himself in moral space. And conscience, at least at this first level, is nothing other than this orientation, this stance, and this holding on. The analysis I am suggesting here, in a line one might call neo-Aristotelian, attests to what extent the question "what ought I to do?" is secondary in relation to the more elementary question of knowing how I might wish to live my life. Let us say, to conclude this first point, that the polarity from which the polarity of law and conscience derives can be summed up in terms of the pair strong evaluation, strong adherence. 2. Let us pass to the second level. It is by coming to be applied to the sense of moral obligation and its negative double, interdiction, that the law accedes to the normative status ordinary usage recognizes in it. I will further draw an advantage, for the analysis I am proposing, from the fact that the term law comes indifferently from the register of law and that of morality. We shall see below to what point the understanding of this bond between ethics and the juridical is necessary for a correct evaluation of the role of conscience at this level. Therefore I propose that we take up the problematic of the norm beginning from the side of legality, in order to show how the movement by which legality leads back to morality is completed in the reference from morality to conscience. Three features of what is legal will require our attention, inasmuch as they indicate the anchoring point of the dialectic of internalization of which I have already spoken. First, interdiction is the stern face the law turns toward us. Even the Ten Commandments are stated in terms of this grammar of negative imperatives: you shall not kill, you shall not bear false witness, and so on. At first glance, we might be tempted to see in the interdiction only its repressive dimension, to see, if we stop with Nietzsche, only the hateful desire concealed therein. But then we would risk not taking into account what we might call the structural function of the interdiction. Levi Strauss has brilliantly shown this for the case of the perhaps most universally proclaimed interdiction, the incest prohibition. By forbidding men of a clan, tribe, or social group to take their mother, sister, or daughter as a sexual partner, this prohibition institutes the distinction between the bond of social alliance and the merely biological bond of reproduction. We could offer a similar demonstration as concerns the prohibition of murder, even if it were to call for a vengeful justice. By withdrawing an alleged right to vengeance from the victim, penal law sets up a just distance between two acts of violence, that of the crime and that of the punishment. 2. And it would not be difficult to offer the same demonstration for the prohibition of false testimony, which, in protecting the institution of language, helps establish the bond of mutual confidence among the members of a linguistic community. The second feature common to the juridical and the moral norm is their claim to universality. I say claim because on the empirical plane social norms vary to a greater or lesser degree in space and time. But it is essential that in spite of this factual relativity, and through it, a validity in principle is intended. The prohibition of murder would lose its normative character if we did not hold it to apply to everyone, in every circumstance, and without exception. If, after the fact, we try to justify exceptions, whether it be a question of aid to someone in danger, say in the case of the controversial hypothesis of a just war, or, across the centuries, the death penalty, this attempt to do justice to exceptions is an homage rendered to the universality of the rule. There has to be a rule to justify the exception to the rule, a kind of rule of suspension, bearing the same requirement of legitimacy, of validity, as does the basic rule. The third feature I want to retain concerns the connection between the norm and human plurality. What is forbidden, universally condemned, are in the final analysis a whole series of wrongs done to others. A self and its other are thus the obligatory protagonists of the ethico-juridical norm. What is thereby presupposed, by law as well as by moral philosophy, is what Kant called the state of unsociable sociability that makes the interhuman bond so fragile. 3. In the face of this permanent threat of disorder, the most elementary requirement of the law, this same philosopher says in his metaphysical first principles of the doctrine of right, is separating what is mine from what is yours, for here we rediscover the idea of a just distance, applied this time to delimiting the competing spheres of individual liberties. Let us keep these three features in mind for the argument that follows: the structuring role of the interdiction, the claim to universal validity, the ordering of human plurality, and let us turn to the movement that, in returning toward legality from morality, finds its fulfillment in the notion of moral conscience as a counterpart to the law. As concerns the first feature, the role of prohibition, what fundamentally distinguishes legality from morality comes to light. Legality only demands an external obedience, what Kant called mere conformity to the law, in order to distinguish respect for the law from love of duty. To this external character of legality we can add another feature that distinguishes it from morality, namely, the authorization of the use of physical force, as a way of restoring the law, of giving satisfaction to victims, in short, of allowing, as we say, the last word to the law. Insofar as mere conformity to legality is based on a fear of punishment, we understand that the passage from mere legality to veritable morality can be assimilated to a process of internalizing the norm. As for the second feature, the claim of legality to universality, morality presents a second aspect of internalization. Opposed to the idea of an external legislator is that of a personal autonomy in the strong sense of the term autonomy, interpreted by Kant as legislation that a freedom gives to itself. Through autonomy, a rational will emerges from a merely arbitrary one, by placing itself under the sin. Thesis of freedom and rule-governedness. However, the admiration we may have for the Kantian elegy of autonomy must not prevent us from taking into account the price we pay for this internalization of the law considered in terms of its universal angle. Only a formal rule, such as the test of universalization to which all our projects, all our life plans, in short, what Kant calls maxims of action must be submitted, can claim the kind of universality that ordinarily leaves things to mere social legality. This formalism, it is true, finds a counterpart in the elevation to the plane of pure morality of the third feature we have recognized in legality, the role that the norm exercises as a principle of order on the plane of human plurality. It is especially among contemporary disciples of Kant, such as Rawls in his theory of justice and Habermas with his communicative ethics, that this dialogical or conversational aspect of the norm finds its fullest expression. Kant had already taken into account the plurality of moral subjects in his second formulation of the categorical imperative, requiring us to treat humanity in our own person and in that of others, as an end in itself and not simply as a means. But it is in the idea of justice, as presented by Rawls, and of argumentation, as presented by Habermas, that we can see the dialogical or conversational implications of this second formulation of the categorical imperative fully unfolded in the figure of the mutual respect people must have for one another. This said, it is not difficult to understand in what sense the process of internalization, through which mere social legality is raised to the level of morality, is completed in moral conscience. At this stage of our meditation, conscience is nothing other than an inward willing obedience to the law as law, through pure respect for it and not out of mere conformity to the statement of the rule. The decisive word here is respect. In a celebrated chapter of the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant makes it the sole motive of the moral life. 5. This is a feeling, yes, but it is the only feeling that reason, through its authority, instills in us. Echoing Rousseau and his well-known voice of conscience, Kant sees in this feeling both the humiliation /QFR avid quest for egoistic satisfactions and the exaltation of our personality over the animal realm. But we will not be surprised to discover under the heading of the voice of conscience all the features of social legality, internalized as pure morality. The voice of conscience is first of all the voice of prohibition, as structuring, certainly, but also as rigorous. It is also the voice of the universal, which is called intransigence. Finally, under the features of the idea of justice and the goad of an ethics of discussion, the voice of conscience adds to these two aspects of rigor and intransigence that of impartiality. As impartial, the voice of conscience tells me that all other life is as important as my own, to take up the recent formulation of Thomas Nagel in his Equality and Partiality. 6. This is as far as we can go with a meditation on conscience in its relation to the law, taken at its radically formal level. 3 words define it: rigor, intransigence, impartiality. The question then arises whether we can stop here. Kantian respect is certainly nothing to sneer at, above all if we develop it in terms of its dialogical applications, as in an ethics of justice or one of discussion. But are persons really recognized in their unsubstitutable singularity so long as respect is addressed more to the law than to these persons, themselves taken as the mere expression of an abstract humanity? And how are they to be so recognized, even under the sign of the idea of impartiality, if we place in parentheses those strong adhesions correlative to the strong evaluations we spoke about in the first part of this chapter, in terms of the horizon of the pursuit of a good life? My investigation of a third level of correlation between law and conscience will proceed from this question. The third stage of our investigation will be devoted to what we can call moral judgment in a situation. Why make a distinct case of it? Can we not reduce the stage to the simple idea of an application of a general norm to a particular case? Beyond the fact that it judgment in a situation does not reduce to the simple idea of application, as we shall see, this latter idea itself is far from reducing to the overly simple idea one too often makes of it. To apply a norm to a particular case is an extraordinarily complex operation that implies a style of interpretation irreducible to the mechanism of the practical syllogism. Here again, law constitutes a good introduction to the dialectic of moral judgment in a situation. The complex process at the end of which a case is placed under a norm involves two interwoven processes of interpretation. 7. On the one side, that of the case considered, the problem is to reconstitute a plausible, a reasonable history, the history, or rather the interweaving of histories constitutive of what we call a case, or better an affair. The hearing, as the centerpiece of the trial, reveals how difficult it is to disentangle a univocally true narrative from the confrontation between the rival versions proposed by the parties involved in litigation. The difficulty is no less on the side of the norm. It is not always immediately clear that this case should be placed beneath this norm. What is called the qualification of a litigious act results from a work of interpretation applied to the norm itself. Recent affairs in France, such as that of HIV-contaminated blood being given to hemophiliacs, remain controversial as concerns the apparently simple decision of indicating within the judicial corpus the norm that should be applied in such a case. Their application therefore lies at the crossroads of a double chain of interpretation, with the facts on one side and the rule on the other. A judgment in situation thus comes about at the point of intersection of these two lines of interpretation. We can say that argumentation and interpretation are inseparable, the argumentation constituting the logical framework and the interpretation the inventive framework of the process ending in the making of a decision. What are we to say then about the relation between law and conscience? It would be an error to think that the idea of law has disappeared from the judgment in situation. In fact, it is a question of saying what the law is in a determined circumstance. In this regard, the pronounced sentence would not have any juridical meaning if it were not deemed fair, equitable, in the sense that Aristotle gives the term equity when the norm covers a singularity equal to that of the case considered. As for conscience, it is nothing other than the inner, heartfelt conviction that inhabits the soul of the judge or the jury, equitably pronouncing the judgment. In this regard, we can say that the equity of a judgment is the objective face for which this inner conviction constitutes the subjective guarantor. The tie between inner conviction and the speech act consisting in stating the law in a particular circumstance removes the judgment in situation from pure arbitrariness. But we have so far considered just one category of moral judgments in a situation, the one we can place under the heading of application. There are many other occasions for exercising moral judgment in a situation. Application assumes the existence of a corpus of relatively homogeneous laws that have not been called into question, at least at the time of the trial. But there exist a number of more embarrassing situations where it is the very reference to the law that causes a problem. We must first consider the case where several norms clash, as we see in Greek tragedy, for instance when Antigone and Creon both figure as respectable spiritual values, but in terms of a narrow perspective that makes them incompatible, to the point of bringing about the deaths of the antagonists. This tragic dimension of action calls for what Sophocles calls tophronion, the act of judging wisely. It is the virtue Aristotle would raise to a higher rank under the name phronesis, a term translated into Latin as prudentia, which we can translate as practical wisdom or, still better, as wisdom in judgment. The first part of this chapter prepared us for this confrontation with such modes of the tragic dimension of action, starting with strong evaluations relating to heterogeneous and sometimes competing goods. It is this tragic dimension of action that is left out in a wholly formal conception of moral obligation, reduced to the test of universalization of a maxim. It is largely overlooked too in the Rawlsian conception of justice, where the confrontation between substantial goods is set aside to the benefit of a wholly formal procedural rule. It is no less overlooked in an ethics of discussion that also places itself in a perspective where convictions are reduced to conventions. The protagonists in the discussion are assumed to have surpassed in assuming what is called a post-conventional posture. It is the task of any formalism, in eliminating all reference to the good life, to elude those situations of conflict linked to the evaluation of goods situated along the trajectory of the wish for a good life. But the tragedy that has been pushed out the door comes in again through the window once the irreducible diversity of basic social goods is taken into consideration, as a comprehensive theory of justice must do. We are then confronted with what in a revision of his theory of justice Rawls himself calls reasonable disagreements. I like this expression that nicely captures the virtue of prudence. The fragmentation of political ideals, of spheres of justice, and, even in the juridical domain, the multiplication of sources of law and the blossoming of codes of jurisdiction invites us to take seriously this idea of a reasonable disagreement. But things become more serious when it is no longer just norms that enter into conflict once the respect owed to the universal norm confronts the respect owed to singular persons. It is indeed a question of the tragic dimension of action when the norm remains recognized as a party in the debate, in the conflict that opposes it to solicitude for human poverty and suffering. Wisdom in judging consists in elaborating fragile compromises where it is a matter less of deciding between good and evil, between black and white, than between gray and gray, or, in the highly tragic case, between bad and worse. Is conscience then reduced to arbitrariness, as some situational ethicists suggest? No. As above, with the judge charged with stating the law in a singular situation, the ethicist, faced with the tragic dimension of action, states the better or the less bad, as it appears at the end of a debate where norms weigh no less than do persons. In this sense, his inner conviction has as its objective correlate the apparent better thing to do in the circumstance. What is more, if this apparent better, to conserve the vocabulary forged on the occasion of the juridical judgment in situation, issues from an intersecting play of argumentation and interpretation, the decision taken at the end of a debate with oneself, at the heart of what we may call our innermost forum, our heart of hearts, will be all the more worthy of being called wise if it issues from a council, on the model of our French National Consultative Council on Ethics, or on the model of the small circle bringing together relatives, doctors, psychologists, and religious leaders at the bed of someone who is dying. Wisdom in judging and the pronouncement of wise judgment must always involve more than one person. Then conscience truly merits the name conviction. Conviction is the new name that the strong adhesion of our first analysis now receives, after having traversed the rigor, intransigence, and impartiality of abstract ethics, and having confronted the tragic dimension of action.